indicating which way they stand on this case.
Thank you very much, Keith Morrison. We'll ask you to continue to stand by there as we now approach about 27 minutes before we hear the verdict in this case. The O.J. Simpson trial, in the course of more than a year now, has been more than a cottage industry for other lawyers as well, as those of us in this business have reached out to them, as they have commented at seminars and in law schools, as they have lectured this country on the nature of the American judicial system and speculated on the outcome of this trial. One who has become a familiar figure here on NBC is Robert Tarver, who is a well-known lawyer, a criminal defense lawyer, and he is in Chicago today. Mr. Tarver, if you had to appeal this case, if in fact the conviction goes against Johnny Cochran, where would you begin the appeal?
Well, I think one of the things you'd want to look at very carefully would be obviously the areas that Judge Ito ruled that were controversial. The defense clearly wanted to be able to show this jury that there was a nexus between race and the ability to plant a glove. That was the factor that was missing here. This jury knows that Mark Fuhrman is a racist in using that word. They don't know that he talked about the possibility of planting evidence. I think that is going to be crucial because they would have had to make that jump to believe that he's able to do that type of thing.
Is there a possibility that because this trial went on so long, that the jury simply was emotionally and intellectually exhausted at the end, and that it probably made up its mind very early on?
I think you're exactly right. What this shows me is that at some point during the case, if it is a conviction, it shows me that the jurors turned off during the prosecution's case at some point when they had found the right amount of evidence and basically just tolerated the defense's case. And that's why they were able to when at the end they had to come together, they were able to do it very quickly and very succinctly.
Do you think that leaders in this country, of the legal community and of the journalistic community and the judicial system in this country, and black and white leaders for that matter, are going to have to go to some extraordinary lengths to try to repair some of the wounds that have been left in the national landscape?
On the contrary, I don't think that the wounds are as deep as people think they are. I think some positive things came out of this whole thing. The discussion of race, although it's painful, has to take place in some environment. This was a good, clean, sterile environment for it to take place in. Now the ball is in everyone else's court to deal with police officers who may have racial biases and everyone else, as well as the other parts of the case that were addressed. Spousal abuse. Those things have been brought to the forefront. Now everyone else can deal with them.
All right, thank you very much, Mr. Tarver. We'll ask you to stand by. We'll be going back to you, of course, once we hear the verdict.
Thank you,
now,
Tom.
25 minutes away from the criminal courts building in downtown Los Angeles, and just about now, O.J. Simpson should be leaving the Central Men's Lockup, the Los Angeles County Jail, for that short ride to the criminal courts building. He'll change from his prison garb into a suit and tie. Yesterday, he was visibly stunned by the deliberation going such a short amount of time and the fact that the jury had reached the verdict. He did not, he looked at the jury, but the jury did not return his steady gaze. He was slack-jawed for a time, and he left, as all of us did, I think, in a state of almost no comprehension about how quickly this had all occurred. Before, however, the jury retired, O.J. Simpson stood in court when he was asked whether or not he was going to decline the right to go on the witness stand, and he said at that time, "I have confidence, a lot more, it seems, than Ms. Clark, that this jury, in their integrity, and they will find as the record stands now," he said, "that I did not, could not, and would not have committed this crime." He said that outside the jury's presence. And then Johnny Cochran said to the jury as well, "Remember these words, if it doesn't fit, you must acquit." But Marcia Clark responded, "They told you," referring to Nicole Brown Simpson and Ron Goldman, "they told you with their blood and with their hair that he did it, Orenthal James Simpson." We'll hear the verdict in slightly more than 20 minutes. We'll have continuing coverage right after this. Good afternoon again, everyone. I'm Tom Brokaw in New York and Los Angeles. The clock continues to count down toward a 10 a.m. Pacific time reading of the verdict in the courtroom of Judge Lancito, that it is Department 103 of the Superior Court of the County of Los Angeles. It will happen at 1 Eastern, at 10 Pacific time. That is now 21 minutes from now. And there are so many questions that will be on our minds once we hear the verdict about how the jurors arrived at the conclusions they did and why. We'll be exploring all of those this afternoon as well. Some of the early issues in this case seem to have been set aside, however. You'll recall that when the case first began, there was a great deal of discussion about the place of spousal abuse and marital discord in our society. Ann Taylor Fleming, who has been a contributor to NBC throughout all of this, lives in Los Angeles, knows the culture well, and has been keeping track of that for us as well. Ann, is that an issue that is no longer on the front pages or on the front burner in Los Angeles?
Yeah, it got pushed aside, certainly, Tom, by the whole last go-around and all the talk of race. But, you know, I think if you see a guilty verdict, it'll be right back on the front pages, because that's where it will come from. So I think it will really depend on what happens here. And if we have an innocent verdict, then I think race will stay uppermost. Then it will depend on all the people who care passionately about the spouse abuse issue to, you know, bring it back up. But I think it's really going to depend on the verdict. It could re-explode, I think, very definitely with a guilty verdict.
And what about the city of Los Angeles? It has been so divided in recent years by so many events. The Rodney King episode, you've had earthquakes and brush fires, and you've had floods, you've had an economic downturn, you've had some pretty bitter political fights there as well. Is this city emotionally exhausted at this point?
I think emotionally exhausted, but right at this moment, so tense. Not in an explosive way, just sort of low-level decibel tense. I mean, every time I hear you say, you know, X number of minutes to go, X number of minutes to go, you know, I have a knot in the pit of my stomach. I mean, I think we're all waiting for this thing to be over, to be detoxed from it and untethered. At the same time, apprehensive about what's going to come. I think also there is some sense, though, that there have been a lot of painful things that have come up. I mean, this has held a mirror to this city one more time, all the race issues, the celebrity issues, all the things that have marked this trial. You know, I think we always hope at the end of one of these long ordeals that we come together somehow, as Rodney King said, and face some of these demons. I mean, you know, there's great hope that after the police had such a going over, that finally somebody will look at the police force and say, okay, we will not tolerate the Mark Furmans. So I think what you're seeing is both. Right at this immediate thing, enormous tension, some hope, and some apprehension that, you know, there could be some trouble in the wake of the verdict.
All right, thank you very much, Ann Taylor Fleming. We'll ask you to stand by as well. We'll be coming back to you after the verdict is read now in about 18 minutes in Los Angeles. This has been a defining moment for this nation. There has been some criticism about the attention that the O.J. Simpson trial has received. For my part, I honestly believe that, in fact, that it has addressed many of the hot-button issues in this country that need to be addressed. The whole question of violence in America and the place of celebrity, the question of racial divisions, the question of the efficacy of our police departments, the question about what we do with lawyers and what we do with our legal system, and then, too, there's the question of those of us in my business. Are we out of control? Are we no longer paying attention to the important issues before us and putting them in the appropriate context that we ought to? Those are just some of the questions that we've had to examine during the long ordeal of the O.J. Simpson trial. Other questions. We're going to go just outside here now at 30 Rockefeller Plaza in New York. As you can see, a crowd is gathered. This is Studio 1A. It's the home of the Today Show. It's been converted to this NBC News special set for today. And at one of our kiosks out there, I'm told we have someone by the name of Chris Conte who has a question about this trial. Ms. Conte?
Hi, Tom. Yes, if O.J. is found guilty, what are the possible penalties?
The possible penalties are depending on the degree of guilt. If he is found guilty on both counts of first-degree murder, he will be sentenced to life in prison, and since there are special circumstances in this case, it will be life in prison without possibility of parole. If he is found guilty of second-degree murder, it's 15 years to life, and there is the possibility of parole. So there is the possibility that he could be found guilty of first degree on one count, second degree on the Ron Goldman case because it wasn't premeditated.
Right.
But we won't know. But he's going to spend a long time in prison if he, in fact, is found guilty of either first or second degree murder.
Okay.
If he's acquitted, he walks away, and of course, statute of limitations, that is that he cannot be tried again. And everyone in this country knows that. And we expect that if he is convicted, that his defense team will immediately mount an appeal.
Right. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. I want to go back to Los Angeles now, to NBC's Ira Reiner, who has been with us from the beginning. He is a keen expert on the culture of the Los Angeles legal community, having been a district attorney and a city attorney out there, and someone who's been an observer, if you will, of the DNA of the culture of Los Angeles. Where do you think Los Angeles emerges from all of this, Ira?
Well, a little scarred, maybe somewhat exaggerated. I do not think it's going to even begin to approach what happened after the King verdict. We're not going to see that. That was much more violent in terms, not just the reaction to it, but what it was all about. In the final analysis, what we're talking about here is nothing more or less than a murder case. Did he do it or didn't he do it? And yes, there are deep divisions within the community as to how people feel about it, and there are going to be deep divisions as to whether there was a proper result. But I cannot see, and this is not wishful thinking, but I cannot see any kind of serious reaction or eruption that we saw after the King verdict.
Ira, do you think that California will continue to permit cameras in courtrooms?
Not only California, but the rest of the country is going to go away from allowing live cameras in the courtroom. And I'll tell you why I think it's going to be that. I think that all of the problems of the criminal justice system that have been revealed by the live camera are going to be blamed on the live camera. The camera did not cause these problems. Oh, clearly it may have exacerbated some of them and exaggerated others, but the camera really revealed the problems. And the legal profession is like any other guild. No guild likes to have people looking over their shoulder, to have the public look in and in effect see how sausages are being made. And although I have never seen a trial, and I dare say no one else has, that has included everything that this trial has included, there wasn't one thing that I saw in this trial that I hadn't seen in other trials, things that we're not proud of. And I think it was a major public service that the public could see all, well, maybe not all, but a great many of the problems of the criminal justice system. And I think that ultimately that will work to the betterment of the system. But that isn't the way it's going to happen, because judges, lawyers, everybody involved with the system is embarrassed, indeed humiliated by what the public has seen. They're going to blame it on the live camera, and we're going to see less and less and less of live cameras in a courtroom.
Thank you very much, Ira Reiner. By the way, they spent more than 600 hours in that courtroom, and the jury was there for only 68% of the proceedings in the courtroom. There were so many sidebar conferences and other times when the jury had to be excused. The anticipation is building outside the criminal courts building. So is the crowd. The countdown is now down to about 13 minutes before we hear the verdict. NBC's George Lewis is on the 12th floor of the criminal courts building. That's just 3 floors above Judge Lance Ito's courtroom. What else has been going on, George?
Well, Tom, there's no camera in the court or outside Judge Ito's courtroom. We have been checking the arrivals of people. The Simpson family has arrived. Shirley Baker, his sister, along with Eunice Simpson, O.J. Simpson's mother. They were greeted at the metal detector by lead Simpson attorney Johnny Cochran. One of the other Simpson attorneys came in. Somebody asked him, how do you feel? What are you thinking? And he said, I'm terrified.
Well, I think that that's probably a normal condition for a lawyer on either side of this case at this hour. It has been sheer folly over the course of legal history to try to guess what a jury is likely to do. I think a lot of them, however, have been concentrating on the fact that no member of that jury tried to send any kind of reassuring sign to O.J. Simpson when the jury filed back in yesterday and handed in the verdict. In fact, they looked down at the floor, or Judge Lance Ito himself. There were no signs at all. I remember as a young reporter the first murder trial that I ever covered, when the jury filed back in, and it was a guilty verdict in this case, a death penalty case, and the jurors quickly looked at the defendants and then shuddered and looked away, and we knew quickly what in fact the verdict was. Alan Dershowitz, you are a member of the defense team. You're a prominent lawyer in this country at the Harvard Law School. You said earlier that you've been up much of the evening thinking about avenues of appeal. What seems to be the most likely for you if, in fact, this verdict goes against your defendant, O.J. Simpson?
Well, you know, all appellate lawyers are programmed to be pessimists. That's our job. We think of the worst-case scenario. So I have been preparing to lay a groundwork for an appeal literally literally from June of 1994. The issues would range from the search and seizure, the climbing over O.J.'s wall on the pretense that they were going there to help him when they really suspected him right from the beginning, the way in which the court dealt with the Furman tapes, only letting in 2 snippets and not allowing real effective use of the material on the tapes about evidence planning and perjury, Furman's pleading the Fifth Amendment without the jury learning why he didn't complete his cross-examination, the issue of how the court dealt with Thano Paradas, the cop clerk who testified under oath that he had taken 8 cc's of blood from O.J. Simpson, which was consistent with the defense theory, and then in a kind of schmoozing session with the prosecution on video, uncross-examined and without any oath, he retracted that and allowed himself to be suggested to that the amount of blood was much less, consistent with the prosecution theory. The judge's decision allowing in history of spousal discord that ranged over 18 years, including a joke and a dream and an incident in a bar. These are all issues that any decent appellate lawyer would think about raising on an appeal if there were to be an appeal in this case.
Mr. Dershowitz, what's your objective? Trying to get the case thrown out entirely or just a retrial?
Well, no, in a case like this, you're basically seeking a retrial because what you're doing is challenging the rulings of the court, and I think the primary goal would be to try to get a trial with rulings that would be fairer to the defendant. But, you know, once there's been a conviction, if there were to be a conviction in this case, the likelihood of prevailing on appeal goes down considerably. Only between 5 and 10% of appeals around the country result in reversals. This is a much stronger appeal than that, but nobody should be misled into thinking that appellate reversals are very common in this country. We will work very hard and present the best possible appeal we can. We've already done much of the work in preparing for it. We filed probably between 25 and 30 motions, which are really the drafts of what will become the appeal in this case. But there's no predicting how an appeal will come out any more than there's predicting even 10 minutes now before the verdict what the verdict is likely to be. But my job is to be the pessimist and to be concerned. I have one more statement I do want to make, and that is, as a member of the Simpson defense team who would himself feel that a conviction would be unjust and would have denied O.J. Simpson a fair trial, I really do appeal to everybody out there to remain calm, to work within the system. That's why we have appellate courts. There are cases in which convictions are reversed, and I would simply urge that if anybody wanted to help O.J. Simpson or the defense team, the worst way to do it would be to engage in any kind of misconduct, violence, or unlawful conduct. We can do best within the system, and I hope everybody will work within the system to see justice done.
Thank you, Mr. Dershowitz. An appropriate cautionary note to everyone. We are now 8 minutes away from the verdict itself. We have wired up around the world, literally various venues. This is the Southwest Law School in Los Angeles. That is the alma mater of Marcia Clark. Those are law students who are gathered there in a lounge, I suspect, to be able to watch this verdict read on television. They're in a fairly giddy mood because they're on television and they get a break from their law classes today. It's interrupted business around the country. Sam Nunn, the very powerful member of the United States Senate from the state of Georgia, had scheduled a news conference today. Most people thinking that he was going to say that he was going to retire from the United States Senate. He decided that he would postpone that announcement until Friday or Monday. They've also delayed in Washington the State Department briefing for 15 minutes, the affairs of the world on hold while everyone goes to a television set to see, in fact, what the verdict is in the O.J. Simpson case, now 7 minutes away. Here's Kelly O'Donnell now on the 12th floor of the criminal courts building. Kelly has been in the courtroom on many occasions. She has watched that jury. We were both there just last week, Kelly. I would never have guessed at that time, given the demeanor and the behavior of the jury as they watched Marcia Clark, that they would have come to this kind of a swift conclusion, whatever the verdict happened to be.
Well, what is interesting also this morning is the demeanor and behavior of the families outside Judge Ito's courtroom. Just a few minutes ago, I returned from the 9th floor where everyone is awaiting the verdict, and we saw a really emotional moment. The Brown family entered. The Simpsons were already there, and Nicole Brown Simpson's sisters, her mother, embraced O.J. Simpson's sisters and his mother. It was an emotional moment, hugs, tears, offers of goodwill between the two families. Jason Simpson, Arnell Simpson, and their mother, Marguerite Simpson, O.J. Simpson's first wife, were farther down the hallway together, huddled together closely, but there were many exchanges of goodwill between these families that have both suffered so much and are both awaiting the verdict.
In fact, there has been that goodwill throughout the trial because the Browns were very sympathetic to O.J. Simpson at the beginning of this ordeal. Denise began to speak out against him more forcefully, but in fact, that family owed a lot to O.J. Simpson economically before the tragic murder of their daughter. The Goldman family, it's an entirely different situation.
The Goldmans were also there today, many people offering them good wishes of support. There was no contact that I could see between the Goldmans and the Simpsons, although Nicole Brown Simpson's sisters did exchange a few words with Mr. Goldman and Kim Goldman. Johnny Cochran came out earlier and asked O.J. Simpson's sister, Carmelita Simpson-Durio, how she was doing. She said she had not slept at all, no surprise to anyone, and they all said that they would offer a prayer and wish for the best. Judita Brown said she just wants to go home. Tom?
Thank you very much, Kelly O'Donnell. O.J. Simpson in his football playing days was a man known for his last-minute heroics. In closing moments of many, many big games, he broke loose and scored touchdowns and saved the day. Now, less than 5 minutes left in the trial of his life, and O.J. Simpson has nothing to say about saving this day for him. The crowd, as you can see here at 30 Rockefeller Plaza, is growing to considerable proportions as well. They'll be able to see from our television coverage here and from a banner that we have, an electronic banner going around the building itself, what the verdict is in. This is a scene that's being repeated not just here, but in downtown Los Angeles at the Criminal Courts building, and we want to go now to Keith Moore.
His sentence is life in prison without the...
About 4 minutes left.
And let me set a scene for you, Tom. This is a hot, oppressive sort of morning in Los Angeles. There are probably now 1,000 or 1,500 people spread around the courtroom behind police barricades, police on horseback, police on foot, police in their cars, through loudspeakers telling the crowd to stay back. We hear the cries of people in that crowd still campaigning one way or another for a verdict of some kind. The anticipation is reaching quite a fever pitch here. Helicopters hovering overhead. It's a scene of anticipation in front of the courthouse, Tom.
All right, thanks very much, Keith Morrison. We're coming up now on 3.5 minutes to the reading of the verdict in Judge Lancito's courtroom. We want to show you briefly the scene in London as well. People are gathered in pubs and other venues in London and throughout Europe. They now have access, of course, not only to the NBC Super Channel, to various other American television outlets, including CNN, and they're able to watch what is going on there. We can or we cannot show you what is going on in London. Well, with just 3 minutes left, I was asking to see if we could see London for just a moment, if we could just take a look at what is going on there, because the world is wired at this point for this situation that is now counting down. Less than 3 minutes left to the verdict in the Department 103 in the courtroom of Judge Lancito. O.J. Simpson is in the courthouse. He was taken earlier today from the Los Angeles County men's lockup. He faces the possibility of life in prison without parole, 15 years to life in prison, or he'll walk out a free man, but as he acknowledged much earlier in this ordeal, a marked man. Wherever he goes, people will point at him, and he said he just couldn't handle that. He may, in fact, be forced to handle that in one degree or another. We want to go back out to Los Angeles now, and let's go to the various experts that we've had with us throughout this long ordeal, who are assembled very quickly. There you see Jack Ford, the upper right-hand corner, Roy Black, the upper left-hand corner, Ira Reiner, and Jerry Spence. Once around the horn, Roy, you still think acquittal?
Tom, I have to say, intellectually it looks like guilty, but emotionally I think innocent. But let me just tell you, my wife last night, Leah, kept yelling all night long, he's guilty, and she used to be a juror.
All right. And Jack Ford, you're still standing in the middle?
Tom, it's a difficult thing to call. You have somebody such as Roy Black saying intellectually all the signs point to a guilty verdict, and that's right. The signs that we saw in the courtroom, the fact that jurors wouldn't look at him, there's an interesting possibility here which would play into what Roy said. Jurors might not be looking at him because they went in that courtroom and they said in their hearts they think he's guilty, but there's not enough evidence here. So they could be walking in the courtroom saying, we find what you did despicable, but we can't bring ourselves to find you guilty. So there's so many signs in there, it makes it difficult for us to do anything more than guess.
Jerry Spence, a different spin on all of this. What would surprise you most in terms of a verdict at this moment? Now 1 minute away.
The thing that would surprise me most is if indeed he walked. It seems to me like the evidence points to a guilty verdict. It seems to me that the evidence from the standpoint of the country is contrary-wise, that we've got a jury that's filled with black folks that have to go home and explain this to a black community. We may have misjudged those black folks.
All right,
we may have judged that community.
Ira Reiner, if in fact he's convicted, and you have been critical of the prosecution presentation here, it will be a great triumph for the district attorney's office, won't it?
There is no question about it. This is the case of the century for the country, but it's the case of the century for the DA's office as well. And with all the talk about they're only there to seek justice, and indeed they are, boy, winning, it counts for a great deal.
All right, thanks very much. Ira Reiner, Jerry Spence, Jack Ford, and Roy Black will be coming back to you after the verdict is read, after we get all the reaction of the principals as well. We want to tell you that this is a courtroom that is tightly run by Judge Lancito. We can only go to it electronically, that is on television, when he gives us the signal. We are now at the H hour, if you will. It is 1 o'clock Eastern Time. It is 10 a.m. Pacific Time in Los Angeles. O.J. Simpson is in a holding room just outside the courtroom. Judge Lancito will enter the courtroom. He will then, at that moment, have given the signal for the television coverage to begin. The jury will file in. We believe that the verdict will be read by a court reporter, and the court reporter will ask the jury foreman, a 50-year-old divorced black woman, whether in fact this represents the accurate judgment of this jury. There's a good possibility as well that the jurors will be polled individually. There is no chance that they could have changed their mind in the last 24 hours or so, according to the official verdict. But in fact, and we've seen these moments before, one of them may say, if they are polled individually, no, I have some second thoughts, and another uproar would develop. That seems to be highly unlikely. The camera in the courtroom is a small remote camera that is controlled by someone representing all of those of us who are showing you the pictures in the courtroom. It has been unplugged from time to time by Judge Lancito. Most recently, just last week, when he thought it was too close to the notes that O.J. Simpson was keeping, and that would be a violation of the attorney-client relationship that was going on during the sidebar conference, but then it was quickly reinstated. However, this trial does come out. There will be many debates around the country at universities, in legal circles, and in state legislatures and the Congress. Now let's go to the courtroom. The moment has arrived.
All right, back on the record in the Simpson matter. Mr. Simpson is again present before the court with his counsel, Mr. Shapiro, Mr. Cochran, Mr. Kardashian, Mr. Bailey, Mr. Blazier. People are represented by Ms. Clark, Mr. Darden, and Mr. Hodgman. The jury is not present. Good morning, counsel.
Good morning, Your Honor.
All right, the record should reflect that earlier this morning at 9 o'clock, the court met informally with counsel here in the courtroom, because there are too many lawyers to go into chambers this morning, for the purposes of discussing notifications to the jurors regarding their rights of privacy and the interest of the news media to interview them or speak to them following the delivery of the verdict in court here today. The court distributed to the parties copies of the questionnaire that has been distributed to the jurors, and also the notice to them regarding confidentiality under 237 of the Code of Civil Procedure. And those two questionnaires have been returned by the jurors. They have uniformly indicated their desire that their private information remain confidential. They have also indicated to the court unanimously a desire not to speak to the attorneys after the conclusion of the trial, and not to speak with the news media either. All right, counsel, is there anything else we need to take up before I invite the jurors to join us? All right, Deputy Trower, let's have the jurors, please.
There is nothing that we can say or do that would add to the suspense or to the drama of this moment. The jurors are being led back in, and just so they will not accidentally be shown on camera, the camera goes to the seal above Judge Lance Ito's high bench there in Department 103 of the Criminal Courts building. It's a relatively small courtroom. Most of the seats in the public area are taken up by representatives of the news media and the family, just a few seats for the public on a daily basis, and therefore television has been vitally important to share what has been going on with the community there and at large. Johnny Cochran has never been beaten by the Los Angeles District Attorney's Office. On the other hand, Chris Darden has won 19 murder cases in a row. And Marcia Clark is widely regarded as one of the most tenacious prosecutors in the country.
Please be seated. And the record should reflect that we have now been rejoined by all the members of our jury panel and our alternates. Good morning again, ladies and gentlemen. All right, Mrs. Robertson, would you, do you have the envelope with the sealed verdict forms, please?
Yes, Your Honor.
All right, would you give those to Deputy Trower? And would you return those to our four-person juror number one? All right, Madam Foreperson, would you please open the envelope and check the condition of the verdict forms? All right, Madam Foreperson, you've had the opportunity to review the verdict forms.
Yes.
Are they the same forms that you signed, and are they in order?
Yes, they are.
All right, would you hand those, please, to Deputy Trower? And you have signed and dated those verdict forms indicating the jury's verdict?
Yes.
All right, thank you. All right, ladies and gentlemen and of the jury, I'm going to ask that you carefully listen to the verdicts as they are being read by the clerk, Mrs. Robertson. As after the verdicts have been read, you will be asked if these are your verdicts. And I would caution the audience during the course of the reading of these verdicts to remain calm, and that if there is any disruption during the reading of the verdicts, the bailiffs will have the obligation to remove any persons disrupting these proceedings. All right, Mrs. Robertson. All right, Mr. Simpson, would you please stand and face the jury? Mrs. Robertson.
Superior Court of California, County of Los Angeles, in the matter of the people of the state of California versus Orenthal James Simpson, case number BA097211. We, the jury, in the above entitled action, find the defendant Orenthal James Simpson not guilty of the crime of murder in violation of Penal Code Section 187A, a felony upon Nicole Brown Simpson, a human being, as charged in count 1 of the information. Superior Court of the State of California, County of Los Angeles, in the matter of the people of the State of California versus Orenthal James Simpson. We, the jury, in the above entitled action, find the defendant Orenthal James Simpson not guilty of the crime of murder in violation of Penal Code Section 187A, a felony upon Ronald Lyle Goldman, a human being, as charged in count 2 of the information. We, the jury, in the above entitled action, further find the special circumstance that the defendant, Orenthal James Simpson, has in this case been convicted of at least one crime of murder of the first degree and one or more crimes of murder of the first or second degree to be not true. Signed this 2nd day of October 1995, Juror 230. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, is this your verdict? So say you one, so say you all.
All right, counsel, Mr. Simpson, would you be seated, please? Let's have it quiet in the courtroom, please. All right, Mrs. Robertson, would you please poll the jurors?
Poll the jurors. Juror number 1, as to count 1, is this your verdict? Juror number 2, as to count 1, is this your verdict? Juror number 3, as to count 1, is this your verdict? Juror number 4, as to count 1, is this your verdict?
Yes.
Juror number 5, as to count 1, is this your verdict?
Yes.
Juror number 6, as to count 1, is this your verdict?
Yes.
Juror number 7, as to count 1, is this your verdict? Juror number 8, as to count 1, is this your verdict? Juror number 9, as to count 1, is this your verdict? Juror number 10, as to count 1, is this your verdict? Juror number 11, as to count 1, is this your verdict? Juror number 12, as to count 1, is this your verdict? Okay, count 2. Juror number 1, as to count 2, is this your verdict?
Yes.
Juror number 2, as to count 2, is this your verdict?
Yes.
Juror number 3, as to count 2, is this your verdict? Juror number 4, as to count 2, is this your verdict?
Yes.
Juror number 5, as to count 2, is this your verdict?
Yes.
Juror number 6, as to count 2, is this your verdict?
Yes.
Juror number 7, as to count 2, is this your verdict?
Yes.
Juror number 8, as to count 2, is this your verdict?
Yes.
Juror number 9, as to count 2, is this your verdict?
Yes.
Juror number 10, as to count 2, is this your verdict? Juror number 11, as to count 2, is this your verdict? Juror number 12, as to count 2, is this your verdict?
All right, the clerk is directed to record the verdicts as read. The parties agree to waive reading of the verdicts as recorded. Mr. Cochran, do you waive reading of the verdicts as recorded?
Yes, we do.
Ms. Clark. Thank you. All right, ladies and gentlemen, I want to at this time take this opportunity to publicly thank you for the service that you've given to us. The burdens that we've placed upon you were enormous, and words can't begin to express the debt that we owe to you for the time and patience and exertion that you've given to us during the course of this case. I will have an opportunity to meet with you privately later, and I'll give you my private comments when we have a chance to meet. I want to caution you at this time that there is, as you know, intense media interest in this case. The news media will probably seek you out at your home or at your place of business. And I would implore that the news media act responsibly to avoid harassing you or identifying you without your consent or otherwise causing you concern. Whether you wish to cooperate with the news media is, of course, entirely up to you. However, I must warn you to expect the worst as far as that is concerned. We want to, I know I share with you in expressing our thanks to the bailiffs from the Sheriff's Department, to our court reporters, Ms. Foxham and Ms. Olson, to the research attorney, John Byrne, who's assisted us, our Pepperdine law clerks, Mr. Golub and Ms. Carswell, our media liaison, Jerry Ann Hazlett, and her staff, and of course the jury commissioner, Gloria Gomez, and her staff. All right, counsel, is there anything we need to take up before we excuse the jurors, Mr. Cochran?
One last time.
That's the family of Ron Goldman, obviously shattered by the decision of the jury. The people have spoken. O.J. Simpson not guilty on all counts in the murders of his ex-wife, Nicole Brown Simpson, and Ron Goldman.
All right, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, I am now going to excuse you from further service on this case. As you know, this does absolve you from your vows of silence. You may take with you your juror notebooks as you have requested, and we'll be chatting with you shortly. All right, thank you very much, and I'll see you all later. All right.
A tradition in American jurisprudence holds that there is a quick verdict. It's almost always for acquittal. No one knew quite what to expect in this case because there have been so many unexpected twists and turns, but in fact, after a very short deliberation yesterday, after a rereading of Alan Park's testimony, which many people thought indicated that they were going to go for a conviction, this jury has decided that Orenthal James Simpson is not guilty on all counts in the murder of his ex-wife and Ron Goldman. He walks out of this court a free man, but a changed man as well. There will be many questions about the future of O.J. Simpson, who had been one of the most popular folk heroes in our popular culture. Now, what kind of life will he have? Will he be able to reclaim the custody of his children? And where do they go to live?
Appropriate Sheriff's facility and released forthwith. All right, we'll stand in recess.
He has been released forthwith. He does not return to the Los Angeles County Jail for one more hour. He is now a free man. Double jeopardy in the American judicial system means that he cannot be retried for these murders. This case is over. It's been an extraordinary experience for everyone involved. No one knew quite what to expect when the jury filed back in today, and just about 7 minutes ago, when the verdicts were read in that courtroom, you saw the visible signs of relief on the part of O.J. Simpson. You heard the sobs of disbelief from the family of Ron Goldman, and the family of Nicole Brown, sitting in the back of the public section, seemed to be stunned but showed no visible signs of an emotional outburst of any kind. Let's go now back to Los Angeles to our various experts who are assembled there. Ira Reiner and Roy Black, you called this case right. Ira, what do you think was the ultimate decision that the ultimate piece of evidence or absence of piece of evidence, or the ultimate piece of testimony that might have made the difference here?
Well, Tom, the prosecution was haunted throughout the entire case by the sloppiness and the carelessness of the investigation by the police department and by the coroner's office, and that came back to haunt them throughout the case. And then perhaps they were finished off by the whole business of the Furman tapes, which was just devastating. And you cannot ignore the question of race. That was a central issue to this case. The defense said that they were not going to play the race card, but of course they did. And the whole question of race enters into it in the sense that there is a major division in terms of how people look at this case, whether they are black or white. And the jury was predominantly black, and Johnny Cochran played to those sensibilities, and he played to it very skillfully. And you know, I think Jack Ford may have hit on something earlier when he was commenting on the jury's failure to look at Simpson when they came in for the jury reread of testimony yesterday, suggesting that perhaps what it was is they understood he was guilty, but they were not prepared to convict him, and therefore they could not look at him. In any event, this was devastating for the prosecution. They worked long and hard and well, but it did not have the result, obviously, that they wanted.
Ira and the rest of you stand by there for a moment. We want to just show you some videotape now of one member of the defense team who was already preparing avenues of appeal as he watched the verdict come in. That's Alan Dershowitz of Harvard Law School. Here he is watching the videotape.
The jury in the above entitled action find the defendant Orenthal James Simpson not guilty of the crime of murder in violation of Penal Code Section 187A, a felony upon Nicole Brown Simpson, a human being, as charged in count 1 of the information.
No, Alan Dershowitz does seem to be quite calm as he sits in his office, watching.
State of California versus Orenthal James Simpson. We, the jury, in the above entitled action, find the defendant, Orenthal James Simpson, not guilty of the crime of murder in violation of Penal Code Section 187A, a felony upon Ronald Lyle Goldman, a human being, as charged in count 2 of the information.
Mr. Dershowitz, let's go to you live now after we have seen that videotape of you watching that. Your colleague Barry Scheck, who made the technical arguments, the DNA case, took apart the police investigative techniques and some of the forensic evidence as it was assembled by the Los Angeles County authorities, said to me earlier today, I know where Alan is coming from, but I have great confidence in our ability to persuade this jury that, in fact, that this case was tainted. It turns out that Barry Scheck was correct. You had some severe doubts about that.
Well, I'm the pessimist on the team, but I'm thrilled, of course, and I'm relieved. I'm also proud of having brought Barry Scheck into this case, because I think the contributions of the scientist lawyers really not only brought about justice in this case, but brought about a national civics lesson on distrusting the police and prosecutors when they rush to judgment in a case of this kind and focus only on one defendant. I have to disagree with Ira Reiner about the race issue. I think the fact that 12 jurors, 3 of whom were not African American, came to so quick a verdict, including one woman who had served on a previous jury and was able to turn them around from 11-1 for acquittal to 11-1 for conviction, showed that the arguments in this case transcended racial lines and appealed to all the reasonable people on the jury. I think basically the prosecution's case fell apart because of the sloppiness of the police, their focus on one suspect. The lab in LA, which for all of us who believe in law enforcement, has to be upgraded and improved. The message of this case is, please, Los Angeles, upgrade your police force, upgrade your laboratories. Don't allow mistakes like this to happen again. Whatever you think the result is, whatever you think of the result, surely nobody can be satisfied with the way this case was investigated.
Mr. Dershowitz,
and I think the jury made that clear.
Mr. Dershowitz, the role of the defense team obviously was to give the very best possible legal arguments for the acquittal of Orenthal James Simpson, and they have succeeded in doing that. But if he didn't kill those 2 people, who did?
Well, that's the place where the LAPD fell down. You know, we provided them with information right in the beginning about comparable crimes that were unsolved. They just didn't want to listen. From day one, remember, the DA made an announcement that he personally believed Simpson was guilty. Marcia Clark made the same announcement before the blood tests even came back. We know that from the moment they learned from Mark Furman that O.J. Simpson had been previously in trouble with the police about spousal discord, we know that immediately they put the finger of suspicion on O.J. Simpson and O.J. Simpson alone. And the great tragedy is there may be somebody out there who is guilty and who the LAPD did not investigate. Look, the job of the jury is not to solve the crime. The job of the jury is to decide whether or not the prosecution made its case beyond a reasonable doubt. The jury has made that decision. It made it quickly. It made it unequivocally. It made it dramatically. And under the American system of justice, Orenthal James Simpson is now a free man, and he is free to go, and the LAPD has a lot of work to do to make sure that events like this don't repeat.
Jeff Toobin is a writer for The New Yorker. He has been seen a good deal here on NBC during the course of this trial. He was in the courtroom at the time the verdict was read, and as I remember the seating plan there, you're not too far from the Goldman family. Obviously, they were emotionally distraught by what they heard there today. Did Mr. Goldman have anything to say as he left the courtroom? Well, we'll get that audio repaired, and we'll go back to Mr. Toobin, who was in the courtroom. Keith Morrison is just outside the criminal courts building, and he was there when the verdict was read. Most of the people who were assembled were members of the press, but it did draw a large crowd of the curious as well, many of whom have become kind of O.J. Simpson trial groupies. What was the reaction outside, Keith?
Tom, before the verdict, in the last few minutes, a big crowd had gathered here, and as the verdict was being prepared, the silence that came over this crowd was Quite remarkable. All one heard was the thumping helicopters overhead, and then the verdict was read, and the place just erupted in a spontaneous cheer. They were dancing, they were singing, they were happy. This is clearly a crowd that wanted a not guilty verdict, and when the not guilty verdict came down, we saw one lonely person standing in the middle of the crowd with a sign that said, "He's guilty," and the rest, for 15 minutes, kept singing and dancing and cheering about what happened. Tom?
All right, thank you very much, Keith Morrison. And the question, of course, is whether or not this verdict will divide the city along racial and cultural fault lines. O.J. Simpson was one of the city's greatest folk heroes. He starred at USC, returned there after his professional football career. He was a familiar figure throughout Los Angeles at celebrity golf tournaments and at charitable events. He was a member of the A-list of celebrities, and you'll recall that during the long ordeal of the Bronco ride, there were crowds that assembled along the freeway system in Los Angeles shouting, "Go, Juice, go." Let's go back to our panel now of Roy Black and Jack Ford and Ira Reiner and Jerry Spence. And let's begin with you, Roy. Roy, you thought emotionally that they had a shot at getting, in fact, you said it would be not guilty. Intellectually, you were a little uncomfortable about that. Do you think that the jury approached this case the same way, emotionally, as opposed to taking an intellectual look at it?
Tom, I'm afraid so. The reason I predicted an acquittal is I thought that the human emotions of the case would overrule the facts of the case, because there are very compelling facts to this case. And my impression is that we in the criminal justice system are going to be paying for this verdict for many years, because the public's perception is that money, power, great lawyers, and the issue of race could overpower the facts in the case. And I'll tell you, my impression is right along that the emotions that are bubbling in this case were going to overrule any of the logic of the facts, and I think that's what happened.
Jack Ford, what do you think the consequences could be for the legal system if, in fact, Roy is right?
Well, I think Roy is right, Tom. You know, people are going to look at this and they're going to make those conclusions. One of the interesting things in it, I certainly think it would be helpful for the entire justice system in society if the jurors would at some point in time, in some fashion, be willing to share their thoughts with us. You know, we don't know what all of this means. People have to understand that a verdict in a criminal courtroom is not guilty or innocent. It's guilty or not guilty. And not guilty can mean a lot of things. It can mean innocent. Absolutely, you had nothing to do with it. It could also mean we suspect you did have something to do with it, but there were flaws in the prosecution's case here, so we feel compelled to let you go. It would be helpful to know what the jurors think about this case, because it would allow us to sit back and realize, well, where should we go in the justice system? One of the other things it teaches us, Tom, is this. We might, as observers, be able to peer into the jury box, so to speak, but we don't have the ability to peer into the minds and the souls of these jurors. And it's always interesting to me, and I'm sure to our other panel here who have spent a lot of time in courtrooms trying cases, that we don't truly know what jurors are going to do until they come out and tell us.
All right. Jack, we want to ask Jerry Spence about this as well. And we want to tell you that Barry Scheck is on his way to these NBC studios. I've been talking to him for the last couple of days. And Jerry, among other things, he said to me that he concentrated much of his closing argument on juror number 3. That is the white woman who had been in another jury case. And as Mr. Dershowitz reminded us, she was able to reverse that entire jury. She held out for a guilty conviction. She brought along everyone else. Scheck said when he made one of his closing arguments directly to her about the tainted evidence, he could see her visibly flinching. What happens in a courtroom in a deliberation like this to the dynamics of a jury?
Well, a jury, I think along these lines, Tom, that a jury has got an obligation not only to determine whether or not this man is guilty of the charge, but whether or not the state has proven its case beyond a reasonable doubt. And I think therein lies the situation. Furman said it. Furman was the one who said it. He said, if I go down, the case goes down. And I think along this lines, there is a message from this jury. I agree with Mr. Dershowitz, who says that the message is that maybe or maybe not Mr. Simpson is guilty of this crime, but one thing we can be sure of, and that is that there was racial shenanigans going on here of some kind that we don't trust. And when people don't trust the police, it doesn't make any difference how good the evidence is. DNA can be evidence that proves the guilt. One chance out of 5 billion that he is not guilty, and yet people won't trust that evidence if the people who were dealing with that evidence weren't honest and trustworthy. And so we may be listening to a jury which is saying we may have to turn loose a man which we suspect was guilty of that crime, but in the final analysis, the proof has to come to us from competent evidence that we can believe and that we can trust. Yeah. There's another problem here too, Tom, and that is folks that have to make this decision have to go back to their own communities and have to explain their decision to those communities. In this case, there were 9 people from black communities that and people that have to go home to talk to their parents, their friends, their relatives, their children, their next-door neighbors, explaining how they convicted this icon, O.J. Simpson, when there was a man like Furman in the background. So the first thing that the L.A. police has to do is to make sure that they take positive steps to reinforce the sense of credibility of their police department, which was totally lost in this case.
All right, thanks very much, Jerry Spence. I can't imagine any of you who are looking in just now have not heard the word. In fact, the verdict in the O.J. Simpson case, not guilty on all counts. And as this country and that community and the world begins to absorb that, obviously, there will be many, many questions. The questions that are the most painful at the moment, however, are for the family of Ronald Goldman. They were in the courtroom when the verdict was read, and Jeff Toobin, who is from the New Yorker magazine and has been covering this trial from the beginning, is with us now. We think that we can now hear you as well as see you.
Hi, Tom.
Did Mr. Goldman have anything to say as he left?
He did not. He really almost, the whole family basically ran out of the courtroom as soon as the jury left. Very noticeably, they did not stand when the jury left, which is the traditional sign of respect to the jury, nor did the Brown family stand either.
The Brown family, we heard obvious sobbing from the Goldman family. The Brown family seemed to be frozen in place, kind of stunned by what they were hearing and not looking at each other and not looking at O.J. Simpson. Can you give me a better reading on how that family reacted?
I think that's exactly right. They did not have much of a reaction except being stunned. I mean, Tom, what was so striking about this, particularly in the moments before the camera went on, is that the defense team looked like they were getting ready to lose. Johnny Cochran went from lawyer to lawyer, and he gave them each a big hug, and he said very audibly, he said, "Be strong, be strong, be strong." And then the prosecution team actually seemed somewhat relaxed. They were all sitting around with not smiles on their face, but they looked relaxed and confident. And then the verdict came, and needless to say, roles reversed.
Well, if there had been any momentum, I suppose, among the second-guessers in the last 24 hours, both legal experts and journalists and people who were just looking in, it was, in fact, that because they asked to hear Alan Park again, and it was a very short time, they'd made up their minds early on, and that the prosecution had probably scored some telling points here. Maybe the DNA stuff was too confusing, and they were seeing the forest, not the trees. When that flipped and it went the other way, and the prosecution had to absorb what had to be for Marcia Clark and Chris Darden, especially, some very, very difficult news. How did they respond?
Well, again, what was curious is they basically stood around in shock. The defense team was hugging each other, clapping each other on the back, with a single very noticeable exception. Robert Shapiro stood apart from his colleagues and walked over to the prosecution table and offered seemingly sincere handshakes to everyone. Bill Hodgman, who is a very even-tempered fellow, gave him a polite greeting. Marcia Clark looked like that it was a good thing she didn't have a weapon in her hand, and he was. And then Robert Shapiro continued with Chris Darden. They stood around. Tom Lang gave Marcia Clark and Chris Darden a big hug. But don't kid yourself. These people are appalled at this result.
Yeah, Jeffrey Toobin, thank you very much. We have one report from inside the courtroom that juror number 6, who's a 43-year-old black male, one of, in fact, 2 males on the jury from the Mid-Wilshire district, gave O.J. a Black Power fist sign after the verdict was read. And a 38-year-old black female from Englewood, I think it's juror number 6 as I remember, wiped her eyes as the verdict was read. Everyone else was stone-faced. Yesterday when they filed in, they did not look at O.J. Simpson. Many people thought that was a sign that they had found against him. Quite the contrary. They found very swiftly that he was not guilty on all counts. Here at Rockefeller Center in New York, just outside of Studio 1A, a large crowd has gathered to watch on television and to read our electronic banner. They now know what the verdict is, and we have a question for our experts from one of the kiosks out there, so let's go outside. Tell us who you are and what you'd like to know.
Hi, Tom. My name's Steve Aldea. How is the LAPD going to repair their public image after Mark Furman took the Fifth Amendment in court?
That's a good question. We don't have anybody directly from the Los Angeles Police Department out there, but Ira Reiner, who is familiar with the LAPD, is standing by in Los Angeles right now. Ira, this has been a long curse on the Los Angeles Police Department. The double standard for justice there, the racist attitudes of many of the police. It exploded into the open in the Rodney King case. There was the Christopher Commission. That meant that we got a new judge, a new chief of police in Willie Williams. He's had his own difficulties. What is the city going to do about its police department?
Well, Tom, I do not want to be in the position of being an apologist for the LA Police Department because, as you have commented on so frequently, I've been a rather severe critic of that department. It has its problems, but I think they are exaggerated. Now, to say they are exaggerated is not to deny that they are serious. And like any police department anywhere, there are indications of racism throughout the ranks, but it is overstated when we talk about LAPD having a racist police department. Now, we have a black police chief in Los Angeles, so at least at the very top, one cannot make the suggestion of racism. But I'll tell you quite frankly...
Ira, just hold for a moment. We're going to tell people that that is a bus that is transporting the jury away from the criminal courts building, presumably to the hotel where they have been sequestered now for more than a year, and the jury has said in the open court to Judge Ito in questionnaires they didn't want to talk to the attorneys and they didn't want to talk to the news media. Whether or not they can hold that pact together remains to be seen, obviously. Journalists will be chasing them down wherever they can, and some of them may make private deals for books or for paid television appearances of one kind or another. But the jury now has left the criminal courts building. Let me just pose it in another way. One of the problems in Los Angeles, to be quite candid about it, is that there's a lot of very violent black crime that goes on in that city. South Central Los Angeles is held hostage in many ways by some vicious and well-armed black gangs. That enters into the equation as well, doesn't it?
Well, of course it does, and that's really true in any urban center in the United States. And look, there is racism within every police department to a certain degree, but to the extent that you're going to get it out, it is not going to come from the top down. It has to come from within the ranks. And by that, I don't mean merely that a police officer has to say that he is not a racist in anything that he may do, but he cannot tolerate racism from his peers. And that's the key to it. That which you will not do yourself, but will tolerate in others, will continue. And if it's going to be purged from police departments, it's not going to be purged from the top down, even with a black police chief. It's going to have to be purged from the bottom up.
Thank you, Ira. We have been wired up, as it were, at many locations around the world to try to get a reaction to the verdict in the O.J. Simpson case. Among the places that we had a television camera was Howard University, the well-known African-American university in Washington, D.C. Let's go down to that videotape and get some of the student reaction as those students heard the verdict. Well, among those students, at least, I think that there is no question that the race argument resonated very, very strongly. It is one that many people, black and white and Latino, were reluctant to talk about openly. But in fact, it is seething in this country, not only in the courtrooms or on the streets, but in the workplace and wherever society gathers. The question is now, in fact, was this a trial about race? And if, in fact, the verdict had a large racial component, where do we go from here? Someone who can talk about all that is Robert Tarver, a well-known criminal defense lawyer who has been an expert commentator here on NBC. He is in Chicago at this time. In fact, what do you think the place of race was in the decision?
Well, I think it was flat square in the middle of it. This case was about race, and remember, the defense didn't put it here. I don't know if it's really fair to suggest that this jury made this decision based upon emotion. I think they could have looked at the evidence very rationally and said that this does not fly because of the doubts that we have. I'm hearing a lot of suggestions that the entire thing was controlled by emotion and simply race, but I don't know if that's quite accurate.
Mr. Tarver, we just want to interrupt you for just a moment. We'll come right back. That's O.J. Simpson leaving the criminal courts building. He is now a free man, forthwith, in the words of Judge Lance Ito. Big questions, obviously, about his future, about what kind of life he will have and how he will lead it, what he will do. He spent most of his personal fortune, so far as we can tell, on his defense, $8 million by some estimates. He did make some money from a book that he wrote while he was in prison with the help of a friend, responding to letters that had been written to him. He was able to sign football cards as well and get some money from that, several $100,000, but given the enormous amount of expense that he had to accumulate in the course of his defense, that most of that is gone. The bigger questions for O.J. Simpson, obviously, are not about money, but what kind of life can he have and whether he gets his children back and where he goes from here and what he does with his life. Go on now, Mr. Tarver, if you would, please.
Well, I simply was saying that I think that in dealing with the problems of race, responsible individuals will see this as a chance to go forward. They'll see it as a chance to build something. Ira Reiner talked very succinctly about the responsibility of the police to police themselves, and I think that that's been brought to the forefront. But more importantly, there are a number of issues here that have been brought forward, and I think everyone, in looking at this, can find something to address about themselves.
Mr. Tarver, thank you very much. We'll be coming back to you during the course of the afternoon and the evening as NBC News continues its special coverage of the People versus O.J. Simpson. Orenthal James Simpson, now a free man. We believe that he's in that minivan driving away now into a new and much different life than he had more than a year ago. It was June of 1994, obviously, that his ex-wife and her friend Ron Goldman were found murdered. He was arrested, charged with those murders. Today, he was found not guilty on all counts by a jury of his peers, 10 women, 2 men, 9 blacks, 2 whites, 1 Hispanic, a very swift deliberation, not guilty on all counts. Where that van will take O.J. Simpson immediately, we cannot say. Where he will go for the longer term, it's hard to know at this time. Let's go to Fort Lauderdale, Florida, where NBC News correspondent Frederica Whitfield was at a restaurant in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, where, like most places in America, everything came to a stop, I presume, and everyone watched. Frederica, what happened there?
It certainly did, Tom. When the verdict was read, all fell silent here. The clatter of the voices, the clatter of the dishes, all of it was quiet. We're at Shooter's Restaurant here in Fort Lauderdale, and among those who were cheering and some of the applause that we heard today was also Steve Gordon. What was your reaction to the not guilty verdict?
I was a little shocked. I thought he was guilty, but I think it shows that the system worked and that there was reasonable doubt that he was guilty. So.
Okay, and Barry Stone, are you surprised that there was some applauding going on here?
Well, I believe that he was guilty, but I think that, again, the system works, and you get the most expensive lawyers, they're going to get you off. And that's what happened. He had all the right people going for him, and they raised enough reasonable doubt that I think that the decision was made before they even went into the jury room.
Thanks very much. Richard Magna, what kind of message do you believe this sends, a not guilty verdict?
Well, guilty or not guilty, there's families involved here, and today nobody won or everybody lost. It's a tragedy for the families and for everybody involved, and it's just a sad day. There shouldn't be any celebration.
What kind of interpretation do you have now on what the judicial system means in this country?
Well, they claim it works, but I still say it's a rich man's justice. If you got the money, you never go to jail. Look at Rodney King.
All right, thanks very much. So again, we have very mixed reaction here in Fort Lauderdale at Shooter's Restaurant. A number of people were glued to the 10 television sets here. There has been a very close following here at the restaurant during the O.J. Simpson trial. Back to you, Tom.
All right, thank you very much, Frederica Whitfield. I want to go back to Los Angeles to our experts out there. Ira Reiner, will there be civil suits against O.J. Simpson of one kind or another after this verdict?
Can you repeat that?
Ira, I was asking, will there be civil suits against O.J. Simpson after this verdict?
Oh, there is a pending suit right now by Mr. Goldman, and there's no question that that will be pursued. And that's an entirely different standard. You're dealing there when you talk about wrongful death as a civil action with a mere preponderance of the evidence. And quite frankly, as long as you need to address the race issue, it'll be an entirely different jury, and there will be perhaps a very, very different result.
Well, we saw some changes, obviously, in the case of Rodney King with the police who were in one venue and then they went to another venue and there was a different kind of verdict. Do you think there's a possibility that in some federal court that there could be a violation of Ron Goldman's rights?
I seriously doubt that. I think that in the King case, they stretched the law about as far as the law could ever be stretched in terms of the question of double jeopardy in order to find a basis for a federal criminal action. I cannot conceive of, I should never say that, I suppose, but I cannot conceive of stretching the law that far in this case to get around the principle of double jeopardy. It's done, it's over. Guilty or innocent, he's a free man.
Ira, we're looking now at what we think is the Los Angeles County men's lockup, and O.J. Simpson may be retrieving some of his personal effects from there, but he doesn't have to spend another moment in that lockup where he spent such a long time, more than 400 days, obviously, in a solitary cell not too far from the Menendez brothers at one point, who are coming back for a retrial as well. We now think that he is driving away from there. Where he'll go, we can't say, but there are so many helicopters overhead, they constitute a small media air force in Los Angeles, and I would think that there will be live coverage of that minivan to wherever it may be taking O.J. Simpson. How they can avoid the press at this point is beyond me. I'm joined here in New York now by a man who was a primary and important part of the defense of O.J. Simpson, who handled one half of the closing arguments. He was the expert on DNA and the collection of evidence, forensic evidence. That's Barry Scheck, who is a passionate New York criminal trial lawyer. He joined the defense team more than a year ago and has given up a good deal of his life to it. He told me last night and again this morning he thought that there would be an acquittal. Was that your heart speaking or your mind speaking when you were talking to me today?
Well, I think it was my mind speaking, because I think that most people misinterpreted the readback. The readback, I think, went to the issue between Johnny Cochran and Marcia Clark over when those 1, 2, 3 thumps were heard. And Cato Kalin had testified that the thumps occurred between 10:40 and 10:45. And if one carefully analyzed the evidence, that really was impossible for Mr. Simpson to have made those thumps and have been at the Bundy scene, because I think we proved very convincingly through the testimony of Dr. Baden and Dr. Lee that the time between the first wound to Mr. Goldman's neck and the last puncture wound in his chest that only created 100 cc's of blood, that the time between those 2 wounds were 10 minutes. The defense timeline witnesses, all independent citizens who were initially reporting their observations to the prosecution, all put the struggle as starting at 10:30, 10:35. So if you add all that up, it's very, very hard for the prosecution's timeline to work. In order to make the timeline work, Ms. Clark suggested that the thumps happened at 10:52. She got 10:52 by saying that Alan Park had finished speaking with his boss, Dale St. John, on the telephone. After that call was over, and the time record showed that's 10:54, then and only then he saw Cato Kalin. She says, well, if it took Cato Kalin 2 or 3 minutes to hear the thumps and then to go out with his flashlight, then we can say the thumps happened at 10:52. So this was a direct contradiction. They had it on one of their charts. Mr. Cochran challenged it directly. And when you listen to that readback, you'll note that they stopped listening at the point where they heard that Mr. Park was still on the phone when he saw Cato with the flashlight.
Did you expect that this case would be settled on the timeline, or did you think it would be settled on the whole DNA and contamination of evidence question that you argue so persuasively?
Well, I think that it's settled on all these things, but if you think about it logically, and I think that people really ought to, because I believe this was a verdict based on the evidence. Obviously, racism was a part of this case because one of the key detectives in the case turned out to be a genocidal racist who the jury didn't know, but we all know, planted evidence against African Americans based simply on hate, and believed in an ethic of policing that the good police officer is somebody who picks out the bad person and then makes the evidence fit. And by his own statements, he's not alone. But my point really is this, that if you look at the evidence concretely, first, in a circumstantial evidence case, both sides agreed, and the instructions clearly indicate, you have to prove opportunity or the timeline. So if you look at the timeline, and our timeline was very strong with independent witnesses, if there's no opportunity to commit the crime, then you must have a reasonable doubt. Now, obviously, if the jury felt that there weren't many reasonable doubts raised about the blood evidence, then they might have gone beyond the timeline and looked at the blood evidence. But once they feel that the blood evidence is in serious dispute and there's a reasonable doubt about it, if the timeline doesn't fit and the rest of the facts don't fit in terms of why he would do it and the demeanor and all kinds of things, I think that the verdict follows from the evidence.
Your only obligation is to raise reasonable doubt. But do you think that they decided this case based on reasonable doubt, or did they decided that O.J. Simpson had nothing to do with the murder?
Well, they decided it based on the fact that, you know, if the timeline doesn't fit, if evidence is manufactured, if it's proven to, I think, most people's satisfaction that Mark Fuhrman was a liar. I mean, people forget, you know. I must say that I've been very disappointed by a lot of the commentary about this case, because I don't think that many of the people watching follow the evidence. Take the testimony of Mr. Rokar, the photographer. He came in at the end of the trial and testified that that picture of Mark Fuhrman pointing at the glove was taken an hour and 15 minutes before sunrise, or at 4:30 in the morning. Why is Mark Fuhrman pointing to a glove at 4:30 in the morning at the Bundy location when he testified that he actually only made that picture and pointed that glove at 7:30? That's a huge, huge contradiction for the prosecutors, because their own witnesses coming in, and if you look at the photographs, they're clearly taken at night. We had a series of contact sheets. That blows a huge hole in the middle of the case. Then you have Detective Van Adder being impeached by an FBI agent, not to mention those two rather interesting characters that came in and testified. If the two main detectives are lying about this, if you have 1.5 milliliters of blood missing, and I don't think there was any question about that, if you have EDTA on the sock, which was a pretty flaky piece of evidence to begin with, if you have EDTA evidence on the back gate, if you have...
The EDTA, give a translation of that, that's a contaminant, a preservative in the blood.
It's a preservative in a reference tube.
Right.
What is it doing on samples, the sock and the back gate, which are not discovered until way later? And if that kind of evidence, important evidence, is manufactured...
You found the EDTA, but their experts did not, right?
Well, no. What happened in this case, and people have to remember it, is that after the opening statement, where we made allegations about the sock, the prosecution said, all right, we'll refute the possibility that there's any evidence pointing to EDTA. Let's send it to the FBI. They sent it to the FBI, and it was the FBI's test results that came back with findings consistent with EDTA in the sock and the back gate. Then their analyst began to back off from it, and the jury didn't even get to hear all the problems with that FBI analyst because it was near the end of the trial, and the judge decided to keep away evidence that the FBI itself had found that his testimony, where he was trying to back away from his own findings, was less than candid.
People who thought that O.J. Simpson should have been convicted will say, this jury didn't deliberate. They made a judgment about a lot of other matters. They were only in there for 4 hours. It's a very complex case. How could they have come to a conclusion?
Well, I think that first of all, these people have been there a long time, and they wanted to go home. And what began to happen in this case, and one can feel it as a trial lawyer, is that there was a certain rhythm developing. As the defense case came in, we put on expert after expert that basically went untouched. Dr. John Gerdes proving that the laboratory was really a cesspool of contamination. Dr. Baden proving that The struggle would have to take most reasonably, period between the 2 wounds, 10 minutes, that the perpetrator or perpetrators would be covered with blood. Dr. Henry Lee coming in with Dr. McDonald and showing that there was a wet transfer on that sock from surface 1 to surface 3, which can't happen if there's a leg in the sock. You know, also doing an analysis of the crime scene and proving how much blood there would have to be. And then there's no blood of any great amount in the Bronco. That's extraordinary stuff.
We're looking now at O.J. Simpson going down the Harbor Freeway. This is a long way from that white Bronco chase, obviously. You were an intimate member of this defense team. When we did not see you in court, when you were just off to the side with O.J. Simpson, were there times when he just lost hope?
No, O.J. Simpson is quite remarkable. The one thing that I found most impressive from the very beginning, and I think every member of the defense team will tell you, is that he has absolutely, unequivocally insisted upon his innocence. He never gave you the feeling, in even a little way, that he was anything other than 100% stone-cold innocent. You never got that feeling. And believe me, there were some dark days, because when some of this forensic evidence started to come in, you know, it looked pretty bad until all of a sudden, you know, it's not a coincidence, in my opinion, that EDTA starts showing up on these samples that are collected late, and that Mark Furman turns out to be everything that we said he was and much more. And that Detective Van Adder was caught in lies, and that there was wet transfer on the bindles. There's a whole series of things that happened in this case that begins to go your way when you're representing a person who's an innocent man wrongly accused. But even if people don't want to accept that, because so many people have told them what they're supposed to believe about this case, what I'm hopeful is that if people sit down and rationally examine the evidence, they're going to have to confront the fact that so much of the forensic evidence in this case lacked integrity, should not have been trusted. And we're talking about samples that have been doctored, and there's good evidence to prove it. And beyond that, I think that the course of the deliberations makes a lot of sense. If the prosecution's timeline can't be true, based on the independent testimony of citizen witnesses who were traveling along that crime scene, who the prosecution knew about before the defense and then chose not to call, if their testimony is standing up and he can't be in 2 places at the same time, you know, they're instructed in a circumstantial evidence case that if an essential fact is not proven, they must acquit. And here an essential fact certainly was not proven. I mean, that jury took one look at the timeline, and they knew they didn't have to go beyond that.
Let me ask you about a couple of other things. There are reports that Robert Shapiro was not comfortable with the closing arguments of Johnny Cochran. In fact, here are your colleagues right now. Why don't you just stay with me, right? You want to hear this, right? Yes. This is Johnny Cochran and Robert Shapiro and Gerald Ullman and F. Lee Bailey and other members of the defense team, Carl Douglas, who were in the courtroom. There were reports that Robert Shapiro was uncomfortable with the closing arguments of Johnny Cochran when he compared Furman to Hitler, that he'd gone too far. Hitler, one of the great monsters of the 20th century, responsible for concentration camps. Were you comfortable with that analogy?
Well, I think that people misinterpreted exactly what was said. He was talking about something different. I think he's about to do that now.
Did you have some rip-roaring arguments within the defense team?
No, when?
Well, at various stages about whether you're going the right way.
Just by having everybody introduce themselves, say their name so that you all know who's here, who will be speaking. That will be followed by Mr. Cochran making an introduction, stated by his family. Mr. Cochran will then make another statement, and then we'll have questions, and I'll recognize those people who have questions so that it's not a lot of confusion.
Howard Harris.
Sean Chapman.
Gerald Ullman. Carl Douglas. Johnny Cochran.
Lee Bailey.
Robert Shapiro.
Bob Blazier, Barry Scheck, and Peter Neufeld.
Shirley Baker.
Jason Simpson.
Arnell Simpson.
Eunice Durden Simpson.
Carmelita Simpson Durio.
That's it.
Joella Demetrius.
Thank you all very much for coming today. First, I want to thank God for this verdict. He always directs our paths, and he's worthy to be praised. And at the outset, Jason Simpson, the eldest male child of O.J. Simpson, will read a statement from Mr. Simpson and from the family.
I want to echo that. Me and my family want to thank God, without whom I don't know where we'd be. He's truly
amazing.
A statement from my father. A statement from my father. I'm relieved that this part of the incredible nightmare that occurred on June 12, 1994 is over. My first obligation is to my young children, who will be raised the way that Nicole and I had always planned. My second obligation is to my family and to those friends who never wavered in their support. But when things have settled a bit, I will pursue, as my primary goal in life, the killer or killers who slaughtered Nicole and Mr. Goldman. They are out there somewhere. Whatever it takes to identify them and bring them in, I'll provide somehow. I can only hope that someday, despite every prejudicial thing that has been said about me publicly, both in and out of the courtroom, people will come to understand and believe that I would not, could not, and did not kill anyone. My father will have more to say at a later time.
Thank you, Jason, and from the family. We will take questions. I'll just make a brief statement, then we'll take questions thereafter. On behalf of the entire team, I'd just like to say how grateful we are for this verdict, because we think this verdict bespeaks justice. We never wavered in our faith. We were always optimistic, and that optimism proved right. I'd like to just individually thank all of the team members. Everybody on this team played a great part in this victory. There's no question about it. We hung together in the tough times. We always saw this day coming, and now that it's here, we feel really good about it. I pay particular tribute today to Joel and Demetrius, the lady over my right shoulder, who helped us pick this jury. We lost 10 jurors, but yet we still had 12 who we felt did the right thing. The other two people who aren't present that I'd like to thank are Barry Scheck and Peter Neufeld, who couldn't make it back from New York, but they're in Neufeld's living room today watching this, and we send our love and regards to them. Mr. Simpson, needless to say, is ecstatic, wants to get on with his life, and we are all ecstatic, so we'll take your questions.
Johnny, a lot of people are already saying that this was a case in which race transcended the facts, overcame the facts. Could you comment on that?
Yes, I'm glad you asked that question, Linda. If you watch this trial, if you watch the arguments, then you know this idea of any jury nullification or the idea we didn't have the facts is preposterous. In the opening part of my argument, through a strategy we devised with Lee Bailey, we said that if we could shatter the prosecution's timeline so that O.J. Simpson couldn't have committed this crime, that there would be a reasonable doubt. That's even before we ever got to the socks, the glove, and Furman or anything else. So these pundits who make those statements don't know what they're talking about. They haven't tried cases. They don't know what they're talking about. This was a case based upon the evidence. And so that's all we were saying. There was a reasonable doubt. And when you see a trial that lasts 9 months, where the jury takes this period of time, they have gone to what we said. And if you look at that timeline, O.J. Simpson could not, did not, would not have committed this crime. And I think that becomes very clear. So I think that's a very appropriate question.
Johnny, was there a point during the summation, during your closing argument, that you were looking in the eyes of the jury and you knew something, was telling you something, that you were winning?
Well, it's always hard to say, Joe, but I mean, I felt that they were very attentive. For a tired jury, they were very attentive. And then one of the jurors got up and went out, and when she came back, she'd been crying. And I thought that was pretty interesting. And then they all started, a lot of them took notes who hadn't been taking notes before. And I could contrast that with the other arguments. They took a lot of notes, and I felt that was probably important.
Yes, please.
Johnny, the jurors went out for 4 hours right before this
this trial, there seemed to be a lot of sadness among the Simpson family. Did you prepare O.J. Simpson for a guilty verdict?
You know, that's a tough question. We never talked about a guilty verdict, and that would have been our fault. But we were so optimistic. We really believed in this case and in O.J. Simpson. And we talked only, even yesterday, when I got back to town last night, I talked to O.J. Simpson last night at 10 o'clock, and he could only talk about going home and seeing his children.
But with the Park testimony, when they asked to see the Park testimony, did you think there was a possibility for a guilty verdict?
Well, you know, what we thought was, you know, we've been around a long time, and what we thought was this, that one or two jurors had a question about the timeline. And I talked to Carl about 5 times yesterday in a row from where I was, and I wanted to know where they stopped, what they heard. They heard, among other things, that Kato Kalin was seen about 10:49, maybe 3 or 4 minutes after those knocks, just like I read in the transcript. It wasn't 10:52 or 10:53 like Marcia wanted to push it back in her timeline. And I felt good about that. So I felt that when you have the rereads are very confusing. You have the rereads, those who have a problem then say, okay, I've heard enough. And they go back in and do their job.
Johnny, this is a question for you, or perhaps
Okay, sure,
one of the members of the family. I wondered what Mr. Simpson is going to do today, now that he's an ex-defendant, where he's going and where he's...
I don't think we can really talk about that because for security concerns, Jeffrey. But he's going to start his life all over again.
And what are his short-term plans, or is he going to stay in Los Angeles, or?
I think he's going to probably address all these things himself soon.
Yes, Mr. Cochran, you have said publicly that you believe race plays a role in everything. I'd like to know what role race played in this trial.
Well, what I said before, Jim, was that race plays a part of everything in America, and we need to understand that. And then we stop ducking and dodging from that, we'll be better off. Now, basically, in this case, I think that from a standpoint of race, it was introduced by this witness, Furman. This stuff about playing a race card is preposterous. It would malpractice if a man has racist views in a case and a lawyer doesn't pursue that. Anybody who says that doesn't know how to try cases, doesn't know anything about anything. So you have to pursue it because that's your job. So they introduced Furman, and then we dealt with it. But we choose to call it the credibility card. I mean, we pursued his credibility. Do you know that on that jury instruction, a witness willfully false in one material part can be distrusted in others? For all we know, they could have knocked out all of Furman's and Van Adder's testimony. So that's the answer to that. I mean, so I think it became very apparent because they brought him. He was their witness. We didn't call him.
Right here. Johnny, in Jason's opening statement, he said that O.J. wanted to pursue the killer or killers in these murders once he gets out. Does he offer any idea or ideas as to who this could be?
I'm sure we'll all talk about that, and I'm sure he has some strong ideas, and we'll be talking about that, and you'll probably hear more about that, Pat, in the days to come.
For now.
With all due respect to the attorneys, I'd prefer hearing from some family members, if I may, particularly the women to my right. What was the last 24 hours like for you? Shirley, Carmelita, Arnell, Mrs. Simpson?
We were prayerful.
Yeah.
We were very prayerful, but we were on an emotional roller coaster. And when one would break down, the other ones would come together and lift them up, and then the next one would break down. So we were just all there for each other. But,
Well, I was always in prayer. I knew that my son was innocent. And I had the support of so many people all over the world. And I know that prayer of the righteous prevaileth much. And I believed in that. And so therefore, that's why I kept the faith. And I had confidence in his representative. Thank you.
Arnell, if I may.
Yesterday was a difficult day, but there was a peacefulness, a calmness for myself, and I know with my other family members. We're a very strong family, and we stick together, and we were very prayerful, and we just knew that no matter what was going to happen, that God was going to take care of us. And we didn't really go one way or the other, but we just knew that God was going to take care of us, and just knowing that we would get through it.
Shirley?
what we knew, when you know that someone is innocent,
you are able to hold your head up high. And that's the one thing that our family has tried to do during this whole trial, is to carry ourselves with great dignity and to let the justice system do what it has to do. We knew O.J. was innocent, and we had all the confidence in the world and the team that was put together, and we're just thankful to them, to O.J., to all of you, to all the people that's been so nice to us. We want you guys to know that we really appreciate the way that you have responded to us in the good and bad times, and we want to thank you, thank you, thank you. And now, I just feel, you know, for so many months you've been asking me, how do I feel? And I tell you, I just feel like standing on top of this table and dancing a jig. And I just want to thank you guys.
Yes, Johnny, do you see this verdict returned as any referendum on the LAPD?
No, I don't want to read a lot of things into the verdict. I mean, I think, and I take this opportunity to compliment the district attorney's office. They fought very, very hard. This was a real heck of a trial, believe you me. You saw lawyers go at it on both sides. It's hard to say because we haven't talked to the jurors. I do believe that there were credibility problems with members of the LAPD, some who testified in this case, and I believe that probably has had some effect. And I think we saw some other things too, and I hope that out of this trial, we always look for something positive. I hope that the coroner's office will get their act together. Citizens of L.A. County should demand that. Hope the LAPD lab will do what's necessary to get up to speed. We deserve better. I hope that the investigators will do better jobs in future cases. I hope they'll abide by the state law. If the state law says call the coroner immediately, call the coroner immediately. Don't wait 10 hours. And I think there's a lot of things we learned in this case.
I'd like to direct this question to Shirley Baker and Arnell Simpson. There are two small children involved in this matter who are currently in the guardianship of a family that believes that O.J. Simpson killed the mother of those children. How are you going to put this family back together?
With God and faith. We got to take it one day at a time. And there's no answers because so much has happened. There's just a lot of mending and healing that needs to take place there. And for me to answer, I can't really answer that question because we just really have to take it one day at a time. But we'll do the best that we can. Well, I don't know. I don't know. When we get to that, we'll deal with it.
I think you should always remember, though, you have two families, the Brown family and the Simpson family, and we are two families, and we have two children that we love, and we're going to do what we can, the very best for the children.
Johnny, I want to ask you what you make of the jury's behavior over the past couple of days, and especially today. They've refused to talk to the lawyers. They don't want to explain their verdict to the public. They came to court today dressed in exercise wear, very casually, after we've seen them for 8 months dressed in suits to come to court. Were they trying to send a message? Were they being contemptuous of the proceedings at all?
I don't think so. I think they knew they were going to go home today, Sally. I think they knew yesterday they had to wait one more day. I think Judge Ito had them all packed, so I'm sure their wonderful clothes that we saw during this trial were all packed away. I think they're a very respectful jury. They were very professional. As all of you reported yesterday, you could not tell on their faces how they had voted. They were very professional. I wasn't here yesterday, and I looked for different things. I could tell today. I could tell today it was going to be all right for us, I felt.
Still try to talk with them?
I would love to, somewhere down the road, talk to them because they've done a really important task here. I would like to do that.
Johnny, there were many yesterday, and no doubt there will be many today, who are about the rapidity with which the jury came to its decision. There are those who say it appears as if it's impossible, that they hadn't either reached a determination on their own, as the judges said not to do before they were supposed to, or perhaps had talked to one another, that it seems as if it just isn't possible to have reviewed this much material in this short a period of time.
What I think, and maybe some of my colleagues will want to respond to this, what I think is this. When they went out on Friday, you remember that I was at the podium when they had a foreperson already. I think this jury had a sense of whom they respected. And in fact, Tracy Kennedy, one of our former jurors, said last night that they always respected juror number one. And so that probably wasn't a hard decision for them. I believe that based upon having participated in the arguments, that this jury felt the prosecution hadn't proved this case. And when ultimately you talk to them, that's going to be where they came down. If you didn't believe the timeline, if you didn't believe that O.J. Simpson had enough time to commit this crime, that he couldn't go upstairs, change clothes, bathe, throw away all the clothes, the gun, the knife, the weapon, the shoes, and all that stuff, Ms. Clark gave him 5 minutes to do all that. If you think about that reasonably, and then tie that into the circumstantial evidence thing, is that reasonable? I mean, who in America, I mean, you get caught up in all these facts, but you got to look at what the law is. So if they made that determination, it didn't take very long. And if one or two people said, well, let's hear what Ellen Park has to say on the timing, then you have a verdict.
So you went on the timeline, not on Mark Furman.
Well, I haven't talked to him yet, but I think it may be a combination of both. I don't know.
Johnny, one of the interpretations of this case is going to be that if you are rich in America, you can get a good outcome. But if you are poor, and then the justice system will just run over you. What is your reaction to that?
Well, I'd like to let one of my brother or sisters answer that question. Bobby Blazer, Bob, Shapiro, anyone?
It's an interesting concept, and there's a lot of truth to that. That unfortunately, in most places in this country, people who do not have adequate funds cannot properly defend themselves. But it worked both ways in this case. In this case, our small group of lawyers that were put together from June the 14th were up against the most intensive investigation probably in the history of criminal justice. Not only did the Los Angeles Police Department participate in this, the Chicago Police Department, the FBI, Interpol. They brought in DAs from 2 different jurisdictions, as well as 40 to 50 DAs. They had upwards of 100 officers at any one time investigating this case. And if we did not have adequate resources, we wouldn't have been able to come close to present all the crucial evidence that had to be shown. If only this case had proceeded based on a grand jury indictment with no cross-examination, we'd have been in a much more difficult position. So I think all in all, we were in a position where they had enormous resources, we had limited resources, and worked very hard.
I'd like to comment on that. I think no matter how much resources a defendant has, they can never match.
You're looking at a live picture now of the van carrying O.J. Simpson returning to his home at 360 North Rockingham in Brentwood. And as you've been following this procession up the freeway, first the 10 freeway, up the 405, it is oddly reminiscent of the freeway chase, the slow speed chase of June 17th, 1994. That was the last time that O.J. Simpson was at his home on Rockingham. You can see that much of the area is cordoned off. However, the police have been instructed, obviously, to let this van through. It is carrying O.J. Simpson, his first trip from the men's central jail, this after his acquittal today on all charges, the charges of murder of Nicole Brown Simpson and Ronald Goldman. The jurors deliberated for less than 4 hours. You can see now the van is turning into the gate at 360 North Rockingham as we continue to watch this live picture. Once again, O.J. Simpson has not been at this home. Aside from the jury visit back in February, he has not been at his home as a free man since June 17th, 1994. You might recall that O.J. Simpson was allowed to tour, along with the jurors, his home. We continue to watch this live picture. We're waiting for O.J. Simpson to leave the van for the first time as a free man after his acquittal earlier today. We are interrupting the defense news conference, which is currently being held in Judge Lance Ito's courtroom at the Criminal Courts Building, and we are expecting the prosecution to hold a news conference as well momentarily, and we will take you live there when that happens. As you can tell, these shots are taken from some distance, which is why we're not able to give you audio. However, you are seeing the scene there at Rockingham. You can see the LAPD officer stationed there. The streets are barricaded.
But I want to make it as clear as I can that this trial is over. No one in our community believes in murder, and our hearts have gone out to...
You went into the courtroom, did you say, I think you guys ought to be working on this part, or here's something that you ought to be doing, or not?
O.J. was a very active client. O.J. had suggestions for everybody.
He kept very careful notes?
Yes, he did.
And did he say at the end of the day, this is where we need to strengthen things? Did he get angry at you from time to time?
Well, O.J. actually was very kind to me, I must say, because I managed to sit 2 or 3 seats down. It was pretty rough sitting right next to him because he really did want to testify, and he really...
As many of you as want to address that same question about the two families and what you can say to them, not what these families will, but what you say to them. They clearly were very upset. Mr. Goldman, as you probably know, mouthed the word murderer when he heard the verdict. He's been very, very harsh on all of you, particularly about the tack that he says that you took. And in particular, I'd like to hear Mr. Shapiro's response to what Mr. Goldman says was a race-based defense.
For a long time, I have been looking for the right opportunity, and I guess there never is the right opportunity, to personally express my condolences to Mr. Goldman and to his family for the horrible murder of his son. I have had the opportunity, fortunately, to express that to the Brown family when I attended the services early on and the funeral. I sat at the end of the counsel table and was the only lawyer who could see the audience. And our eyes would focus. And the anger that he had and showed was real. And I wanted to reach out and tell him that we did have our sympathies and condolences with him during this horrible time of grief.
Let's take you now to the 18th floor of the Criminal Courts building for the prosecution news conference about to begin.
Let the lawyers come in, please. Prosecutors come in. Make a little more room here. Circle in. We're all here. I'm going to ask everyone who is watching, who's listening to this, to pause for a moment. Remember why we're here. We're here for Ron, we're here for Nicole, and we're here for every other victim of violent crime. Our job is to seek justice. This case was fought as a battle for victims of domestic violence. We hope this verdict does not discourage the victims who are out there throughout our communities, throughout this country, from seeking help. I know there are women especially who are right this very moment living in fear, living in violence. We're asking you to reach out for help. There is new help out there. Think of yourself. Think of the children who are in the house too. Don't wait. If you wait, it could be too late. We are, all of us, profoundly disappointed with the verdict. We want to hear from the jurors before we make any other comments concerning their decision today. But it was clear, at least it is to me, and I think other members of the prosecution team, that this was an emotional trial, and apparently their decision was based on emotion that overcame the reason. Certainly we have received calls and letters from all over the country praising the efforts of the prosecution. This was done no matter what verdict was going to be reached. We had many men and women throughout the country call and thank us for the efforts, many in tears. I am proud of every member of my staff, but there are particular people who made sacrifices. To the Goldmans and to the Browns, we cried with you. We shared energy, and as Chris said, during the most difficult times, we looked at you, and you gave us all strength, tremendous strength. We will never know the loss, really the pain of your loss. We tried as diligently, as hard, as professionally as we could to seek justice in this case. My thanks go to all the law enforcement agencies that assisted us. Los Angeles Police Department, obviously, the FBI, the Chicago Police Department, Department of Justice. But I think most particularly, I still, myself as the district attorney, want to thank the two lead investigators in the case, Phil Van Adder and Tom Lang. Los Angeles should be grateful for the professional job and loyalty that they've given over several decades. There are a couple companies that gave pro bono services to us. Absolutely first class. Decision Quest assisted us with many things. Many of you saw the pyramid. That was their idea. They did all of this. They invested pro bono nearly $1 million their own to help us seek justice. Cognitech also helped us. There were many others who helped. We had restaurants and others who were helping with the staff. I want to thank, too, every member of my office. They helped us. They don't have their name out in front, but they helped us. And more importantly, they helped every day with all the Rons and all the Nicoles that we handle every day. This has been one case. It's been an important case. But literally, we have thousands of these cases. Finally, to our team, to our law clerks, who really worked so hard. These were students in law school who gave up so much to work with us. To the new prosecutors who joined our team, who took and passed the bar and became deputy DAs, and they gave their all. To the support staff from Patty Joe, to everyone else involved, our victim witness people, but certainly to the media relations. Special thanks to Suzanne Childs. Suzanne worked the 7 days a week. As you know, she's a lawyer, former deputy district attorney, as well as a journalist. She made your life, the journalists, easier, made our lives easier, too. Our investigators, our Bureau of Investigation, goes unheralded, but they did fabulous work. Especially Gary Schramm and Mike Armstrong and several others. They were there whenever we needed them, whenever the families needed them. They were there. Finally, of course, we have the lawyers that you saw in court. Let me thank them because they did a first-class job. To Bill Hodgman, you know Bill, he managed the unmanageable, but he did it. To Alan Yochelson, to Sherry Lewis, to Hank Goldberg, to Brian Kelberg, to Lisa Kahn, to Brock Harmon, Woody Clark, and Scott Gordon. Every person here gave their all. It was a professional effort seeking justice. We had, I perhaps should give thanks to Woody and Rock's bosses, the district attorneys of San Diego and Alameda County. They helped when we needed the help, and again, it was a first-class effort. And of course, lastly, to Chris and to Marcia. None of you will ever know the personal sacrifices everyone here made. none of you will know, too, the sacrifices that the families of this team made. They didn't see their husbands or their wives, the fathers and their mothers, for 16 months. I think on behalf of every citizen who has been looking at this case in an objective way, I think they want me to say thank you, and I am saying thank you. And let me end by saying we deserve to be proud of the effort that we made in this case. I am very proud of the total effort made in this case. We stand here in front of you with our heads held high because we did everything professionally possible to seek the justice in this case. I'm going to ask Marcia and then Chris and then Bill if they want to make any comments or thank yous. Now would be the appropriate time to do it. We will then, when they finish, address a few of your questions. But I will also add that because we've not had the opportunity to hear from the jury, they've indicated they're not interested in talking to any of the lawyers. Maybe they'll talk to you. We will withhold further comment for the rest of the day. But let me give Marcia an opportunity to say thanks.
I first want to extend my thanks to the families of the victims, to the Goldmans and to the Browns. Their strength, their dignity, and their support throughout this trial have been tremendous, and a tremendous source of inspiration and strength to all of us. My sympathy and my love go out to all of them. And then I'd like to thank the members of our team. You're wonderful. You're wonderful. You've given everything. You've given your all throughout all of it. We couldn't have done any of it without you. You've done a beautiful job. Please don't let this make you lose faith in our system. Please don't let this deter you from doing a job you're so well qualified to do. You're all wonderful. You can make it go right, and you'll have a chance to do it again. And I thank you from the bottom of my heart. And I thank my partners, all of you. You're just fantastic. I can't tell you how fantastic. No one here has spared any effort. Everyone here has put in 110%, given their all for everyone, for justice, for the families of the victims, in the effort to see that the lives of Ron and Nicole were not thrown away. It was a dignified fight. It showed great courage, great integrity, great moral strength. And we have every reason to be proud of every single one of them, and we are. Thank you.
I never expected I would be here in this time and in this place and in this position. If there was anything that ever motivated me throughout the trial, it was the idea, the notion that one day I'd have to turn into the Goldmans and with the realization that he had been acquitted. But that is the verdict, that's the jury's position, that's their voice, and I accept that verdict. We came here in search of justice. You will have to be the judges, I expect, as to whether or not any of us found it today. But I'm not bitter, and I'm not angry. But I'd also like to thank the lawyers on our prosecution team. I am honored to have And please give us a moment. I guess I've always been referred to as the calm one, but it is very, it's very difficult for any of us to speak without great emotion today. The verdict comes as a great disappointment, and I want to tell everyone here, I want to tell everyone in this county, and I want to tell everyone in this country that you can be proud to the hilt of the effort made by the prosecution team in this case. This was a classic team effort. None of us, take all the credit, and all of us share in the disappointing verdict today. I've been involved in a number of long or epic trials over time, and I have never seen anyone work so hard in behalf of the people as the team that we had in this case. And that goes from investigator to law clerk to stand-up attorney in the courtroom to research attorney. Every single person here on this team sacrificed greatly to try to bring the Browns and the Goldmans justice, and to bring justice to the county and for everyone. We won't forget Ron and Nicole. We won't forget them ever. And we may have to carry on the fight in their names in a different way after this. But for the Browns and the Goldmans, we're not going to give up. And for Ron and Nicole, we'll never forget you, ever. Thank you.
Let me, if I might, just to clear the record, too, I left out a couple thank yous. Daryl Mavis, thanks, Daryl. And certainly to my executive staff, my chief deputy, Sandy Buttigia, and Frank Sunstead, the entire staff. I mean, this truly was a team effort. And as I said, one last time before you take your questions, I've been in the office 27 years. I am extremely proud, and every citizen in this county, perhaps even this country, should be proud of the professional effort that was made here. We'll take a few of your questions.
Bill, is the Simpson matter over, or would you consider any possible federal charges, and are there any?
It's over from our viewpoint.
Mr. Garcetti, is this investigation now going to be reopened from square one, the whole murder investigation?
Are you talking about this case?
We're going to find the killer?
The lights just went out. I stand in front of you. We all stand in front of you with the belief that the evidence was there. This was not, in our opinion, a closed case.
Bill, can we hear from Fred Goldman about whether or not he's determined...
The Goldmans are not going to be sworn.
Bill, you said apparently that this was a verdict based on emotion. I just wanted to see if you could elaborate on that.
I couldn't hear you.
You said that this was a verdict apparently based on emotion. Why do you believe that? Was the switch at which it came in?
Well, we had less than 3 hours deliberation after, what, almost 9 months worth of evidence? I don't know. I said I haven't had the opportunity to discuss it with the jurors, so I don't know.
You've done your best. You've had a huge amount of effort and time expended on this, and yet there are people out there in the streets all over Los Angeles cheering for O.J. Simpson. Why is that?
I'm not a psychologist. I can't answer that. I think you probably have more people who are profoundly disappointed with the result. Chris?
Is there one point in this trial that you think was a pivotal kind of turning point, one way or another, that was particularly the moment in the whole trial?
I don't think so. Is there? I mean...
Bill, just to follow up on Kareem's question, considering the swiftness of this verdict after 8 months of testimony, is this a legitimate verdict?
Is this a legitimate verdict? Call it whatever you want. It's the verdict. And I'm not going to put any adjective in front of the verdict. It's a verdict.
Do you think historians will look back on it and consider a nullification verdict?
Well, certainly there are going to be many people who look at this, that this was, in fact, jury nullification.
Bill, all along you said that you had a mountain of evidence. What does this tell you about justice?
Give us a chance to reflect I mean, this is, I don't know how, if you can really appreciate the profound disappointment that we're all feeling. Had this been a close case, all right. But you have professionals up here. We're surrounded by professionals. Every person here has tried so many cases, difficult cases, and very thin cases that we refer to them, where you don't know what the jury is going to do because it's very close in the way of evidence. In our professional judgment, it was overwhelming evidence. We still believe in the evidence in the case.
Given the reactions, different reactions within the city, how do you not lose faith in the system when you have so many people who feel one way about this and so many people feeling the other way?
Give me an opportunity to reflect on this before I'll take one more question.
The ugly truth really at this point, though, that this whole case did cut on race in the end.
Before I have an opportunity to hear what you learned from the jurors, I'm not going to respond to that. I mean, you have to understand that there is profound disappointment, but I have to admit to you that unlike Chris, I have a little anger too. And so I'd rather just be a little more reflective here before I do it.
Concerned at all that this kind of verdict, there are people out there who are not cheering as well. Do you think that this kind of verdict or this verdict will have some impact on people's faith in the system?
I didn't just fall off the back end of the turnip truck. And when you ask, are there people who are going to be doubting the criminal justice system? Of course there are going to be people who are going to be doubting the criminal justice system. But let me emphasize one thing. We've heard it time and again, but this case is not the usual case. Don't look at this case as being really how most cases are handled, or how most juries, or how most judges, or how everyone who's involved in the process deal with the case. That's not the case. The jurors do the right thing, nearly all the time. That's it, folks. Thank you.
Wanting to talk to you. When do you think you can talk to them?
I only have a few things to say. Last June 13th, 94, was the worst nightmare of my life. This is the second. Excuse me. I want to thank, on behalf of my family, of all decent, law-abiding citizens in this country and nation, Marcia Clark, Chris Darden, Bill Hodgman, Gil Garcetti, I'll forget names, I'm sorry, quick help. Everybody, every single person in this DA's office. Until the other day, I had, honest to God, no clue how many people in this office had worked day and night for a year toward one goal, and that's justice. And to each and every single one of them, our profound thank you and blessings. Not to forget Mark, our victim's advocate backbone, this prosecution team didn't lose today. I deeply believe that this country lost today. Justice was not served. I and my family will do everything in our power to bring about the kind of change that won't allow what happened today to ever happen to another family again. In closing, I only have one other thing to say, because I don't want to forget. I forget a lot of things. To my wife, Patty. To my daughter, Kim. To Michael and Lauren and Brian. My other kids. To all of our deep, close friends. Who have been there for us for this year and 4 months or 5 or whatever it's been. Who have helped us daily get through each day. We'll never be able to say thank you enough. I will forever be proud of my son and my family. Thank you.
Thank you all.
An emotional but restrained Fred Goldman, who said that last June 13th, 1994 was the worst nightmare of his life. This, referencing today's verdict, was the second. We just heard from the prosecution and the defense. Let's show you now tape of O.J. Simpson embracing his lifelong friend Al Cowlings outside his home at Rockingham. And this was the verdict read just over an hour and a half ago in Judge Lancito's courtroom, Department 103 of the Criminal Courts Building.
Mr. Simpson, would you please stand and face the jury? Mrs. Robertson.
Superior Court of California, County of Los Angeles, in the matter of the people of the state of California versus Orenthal James Simpson, case number BA097211. We, the jury, in the above entitled action, find the defendant Orenthal James Simpson not guilty of the crime of murder in violation of Penal Code Section 187A, a felony upon Nicole Brown Simpson, a human being, as charged in count 1 of the information. Superior Court of the State of California, County of Los Angeles, in the matter of the people of the State of California versus Orenthal James Simpson. We, the jury, in the above title action, find the defendant Orenthal James Simpson not guilty of the crime of murder in violation of Penal Code Section 187A, a felony upon Ronald Lyle Goldman, a human being, as charged in count 2 of the information. We, the jury, in the above entitled action, further find a special circumstance that the defendant, Orenthal James Simpson, has in this case been convicted of at least 1 crime of murder of the first degree and 1 or more crimes of murder of the first or second degree to be not true. Signed this 2nd day of October 1995, Juror 230. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, is this your verdict? So say you one, so say you all. Yes.
Centrum? I just feel better knowing I'm taking it.
Centrum's complete. Every time a vitamin makes
Of the
me...
People versus O.J. Simpson, the verdict is in, not guilty on all counts. O.J. Simpson has returned to his estate at Rockingham, on Rockingham in Brentwood, California. He is a free man forthwith. The verdict is in. It has been accepted with great pain and sorrow by the district attorney's office and especially by the Ron Goldman family. They have commented just a few moments ago, Fred Goldman saying justice was not done. It was a loss for the country. On the other hand, the defense team, led by Johnny Cochran, opened their remarks by saying, "We thank God." Jason Simpson reading a statement from his father saying that his two top priorities now are to get his children back and to begin to raise them in the manner that he and Nicole had always wanted to. His second priority was to pursue the killers of Nicole Simpson and Ron Goldman. Whoever did that to him, he said he will use whatever resources he has available to track them down. This is a case that has galvanized this country, obviously, and the world, for that matter. There are so many ramifications to it and many concerns as well. The question of race, obviously, was a primary element in this case. Now the question is, will there be racial reaction to it? At the White House, that has been a concern. President Clinton and I talked about that last week. He did have a statement today, and standing by at the White House now is NBC's Brian Williams. What did the president have to say through Mike McCurry, Brian?
Tom, we do have for you now the first initial reaction from the White House. We're told that the president got up from his chair in the Oval Office at 12:58 p.m. He had just vetoed a bill, in fact. He walked into his secretary's office. That's where the nearest television is. He watched the verdict. He is said to be somber following the verdict. He went back to his desk and in his own hand, saying no to a statement that had been written for him by an aide, wrote this: "The jury has heard the evidence and rendered its verdict. Our system of justice requires respect for their decision. At this moment, our thoughts and prayers should be with the families of the victims of this terrible crime." Again, he was described as somber after getting the news, along with millions of other Americans. We should also point out, Tom, that later this afternoon, Attorney General of the United States, Janet Reno, will hold a press conference to talk about, among other things, other ramifications of this case. We're told Detective Furman will be among those matters discussed. Tom?
Thank you, Brian Williams. And at the Criminal Courts Building in downtown Los Angeles is NBC's Katie Couric. She has been out there all week for the Today program and has been covering this case extensively from the beginning. Katie, you were in the defense news conference.
I was, but you know, Tom, what was even more interesting, I didn't have the opportunity to be inside the courtroom when the verdict was announced. But the atmosphere, Tom, before the families walked in could only be described as incredibly emotional and almost bizarre. There were the Goldmans standing a few feet away from the Brown family. Then a little bit further back down the hallway were the Simpsons family talking to Johnny Cochran, obviously O.J. Simpson's sisters, his daughter Arnell, his son Jason. And while Johnny Cochran, Tom, claimed during that press conference that no one really was preparing O.J. Simpson for a potentially for a guilty verdict, that was certainly a possibility, you would never know that because the families of the victims seem much more upbeat. They seem to be following the conventional wisdom, which was saying that asking for Alan Park's testimony was a good sign for the prosecution. But obviously, the relatives of O.J. Simpson were very, very concerned. Jason Simpson, Tom, was sobbing uncontrollably on his mom, Marguerite's shoulder. But one thing that was particularly striking, Tom, is despite all the emotions, as the families entered the courtroom, Lou Brown had his arm around Eunice Simpson. And while Arnell Simpson has said there's an awful lot of healing and mending to be done, obviously there's some really strong bonds that still exist, even to this day, despite all the bitterness and the rancor between these two families, which was certainly a sight to behold.
Well, among other things, they have two children between them at this point because the children of Nicole Brown Simpson and O.J. Simpson have been in the custody, the guardianship of the Brown family in Laguna. Do you have any sense of how that will be resolved, Katie?
You know, I have no idea, Tom. They ducked that question, as you heard, in the defense press conference. And obviously, I think Arnell nodded slightly when they were asked if O.J. was going to try to get custody of his children. I think a big battle looms ahead, and perhaps that might destroy whatever goodwill is left between these families. And I have no idea. I know that the civil suit against O.J. Simpson by the Brown family is certainly going to proceed, possibly at a snail's pace, but I talked to the attorney, John Kelly, and he said they're not going to be up to talking for a few days, but certainly he has his work cut out for him.
All right, Katie, I know that you've been up for about 2,000 hours at this point, out there around the clock, and covering this case extensively. We'll let you get about the business of the day. Thanks very much. Katie Couric, who is in the criminal courts building, and she was in the defense news conference, as you heard. But you also heard her describe that astonishing scene just outside the courtroom before they went in to hear the verdict, in which the Brown family and the Simpson family did have words. Arnell Simpson said for her part during the news conference that she felt at peace in the last 24 hours or so. They've been through so many ordeals, my own guesses, and it can only be conjecture on my part, that there must have been some sense of relief that they were coming to some form of closure here, that they would be able to go on to the next phase, that their father would either be free or, in fact, he would have been found guilty and sent off to prison. It worked out for them ultimately in the best possible way. He was found not guilty on all counts, and he has returned now to his home on Rockingham, which he has not been able to go into for more than a year. It is that very familiar estate. That road leading into Rockingham has been blockaded by police, but even then, the curiosity seekers have been able to go up and have their pictures taken in front of it. It's once again the home of O.J. Simpson. We'll be back with continuing coverage of the People versus O.J. Simpson after this. And he's back at his home in Brentwood, California, the familiar site of the estate on Rockingham Boulevard, a small street not too far from Sunset Boulevard. And it was there that O.J. Simpson returned with A.C. Cowlings, his great friend, in the white Bronco after the long day when he was a fugitive from justice. He now returns a free man. No double jeopardy in this case, although there will be a civil suit against him for the wrongful death of Ron Goldman, and that will continue to take up time and his resources, for that matter. He has already spent millions of dollars on his defense. He earned some of that with his book and by signing football trading cards and by placing his home as collateral for loans. He has some investments that have done not so well in the past few years. There is continuing speculation. That is a sister of O.J. Simpson. There is continuing speculation that he'll appear in some kind of pay-for-view interview series. In fact, some representatives of O.J. Simpson have already approached HBO, and they were turned down by Home Box Office as a venue for that kind of an interview. That approach came several months ago. What his plans are from here, we can't say. At the criminal courts building right now is NBC's Maria Shriver, who has been covering this trial as well. She was in the defense, or rather in the news conference of the prosecutors. Maria, what was it like in there?
It was very emotional, Tom. Everybody very somber. People started crying at different intervals during the press conference, particularly when Chris Darden broke down, as you said a little bit ago, that he said he never suspected he would be in this place at this time with this verdict. And when he went to try to thank the people who had helped him, he broke down and then turned to his right and really started to sob. I looked around. A lot of the young lawyers who had worked with he and Marcia Clark on this case started to sob. Many of the people there, Gil Garcetti fighting back tears. It was a very emotional moment. Marcia Clark ran after him as he went into the outer offices. She came back a few minutes later. But that emotion was intense. But then when Fred Goldman started to talk, you could have heard a pin drop really throughout the entire moments in that area. And he was extremely emotional, crying a lot, saying that he and his family were going to fight on to make sure that this did not happen to any other family. And he talked about his son, how proud he was of his son Ron. He wore a button. There was not a dry eye among the people working for the DA.
Obviously, they would like to talk to the jury before they hold any further press conferences or do any interviews. Were you able to get any sense about when that will be possible, if it'll be possible at all?
No, I tried to ask that, and Gil Garcetti would not answer that. He seemed a little surprised, I might add, that the jurors didn't want to talk to him, and he asked the press, maybe you'll get some information that will help us. What was interesting is when we arrived here early this morning, that floor, they had many of us set up camera crews in anticipation of a guilty verdict, that they would come and be doing interviews. It was a very different atmosphere up there earlier this morning. I then went down to the 9th floor, watched many of the defense lawyers come in, watched Kardashian come in. He was ashen. And I talked to Shapiro, who said that he was very apprehensive himself. He described O.J. as being anxious. I talked to a couple of the family members. I also talked to Larry Schiller, who, as you know, has been visiting O.J., who said that he spent time over there last night when O.J. called, that the atmosphere there was upbeat, and that O.J. himself had spoken to him at length on Saturday about how he was looking forward to an acquittal, and that how he planned to go about trying to repair his relationship with his children. So clearly, he was not surprised by this verdict, but I'll tell you, a lot of people up on the 18th floor were stunned.
All right, thanks very much, Maria Shriver. We'll let you get back about the business of reporting what has been going on there. We have many guest experts who have been watching all of this, obviously. It's been going on for a long, long time. Among them, Robert Tarver, who is a well-known criminal trial lawyer. He's in Chicago right now, and in Detroit at this time is Kim Worthy. Kim Worthy is now a judge. She's a former prosecutor in Detroit. She prosecuted some cases against the Detroit police. Do you think, Judge Worthy, that police departments across this country are going to come under very close scrutiny as a result of this trial, and especially the Mark Furman part in it?
You know, as you commented earlier, we had problems, major problems in Detroit a couple of years ago, and we had to really take a close look at our police department and institute some changes from the ground on up. So I think certainly police departments across this country are starting to do that if they already haven't. But Tom, if I could just comment on one thing. You had commented a few minutes ago about Christopher Darden and some of the attacks that he's received. And I just want to, since we're supposed to be teaching the public also, I was a prosecutor for almost 12 years, an African-American prosecutor in an African-American city almost, and it's so tough being a prosecutor. It's really tough. And it's hard to tell you about the emotional moments it was for me to watch that press conference, because I can really identify with that. And I can identify with him, because when you have problems with a case, and when you have cases that the public doesn't agree with, and you have witness problems and people like Mark Furman, you know, it's not your fault, but you have to deal with it. And you have to deal with it as honestly and as fervently as you can. Because really, all they tried to do in this case is stand up for what they thought was right. And so I really have a problem with anyone who has criticized Chris Darden for what he has chosen to do. Because really, all we want to do in America, and we all can because we're citizens, is stand up for what we think is right. And I think the criticism was unfounded, and I really, really do feel for him, and I think you hit the nail right on the head.
Hear, hear, Judge Worthy. Not your compliment to me, but I think it is something that we all have to think about, and it's a dialogue that we have to engage in. Robert Tarver, you've been trying cases for a long, long time. In many of these urban areas in America, the budgets have been so reduced that things like the police forensic laboratories and the county coroner's office are operating with reduced resources. Do you think that the public now will begin to say, hey, we have to make an investment in our law enforcement agencies, and especially in this modern technological age and the kind of forensic evidence labs that we have and the kinds of people that we hire?
Well, it's probably true, but one of the things we have to recognize about Los Angeles is that for years they have led the country in terms of technological advances in forensics. I think one of the lessons of this case is going to be, particularly with reference to police departments, that we have to look inward and we have to begin to organize better. It's not that they can't do the job or don't even have the resources to do the job. It seems to be a case of disorganization. And I just want to echo one thing. Judge Worthy and I served in the National Black Prosecutors Association together, along with Chris Darden. We've been prosecutors for quite a while, and we served proudly. There's absolutely a wonderful feeling that goes along with being an African-American prosecutor, and those who would criticize Chris Darden in this case, or any African-American prosecutors, for bringing cases against African-Americans are entirely wrong.
But could you understand if Chris Darden decides that he no longer wants to go into the arena, as it were, after this kind of draining experience?
This is a very difficult case, and those of us who have tried long, difficult cases know that after it's all over, at least immediately after it's all over, you have that very strong down period. I suspect that Chris may, if he does say that he didn't want to try cases, may change his mind at some particular point. But there are a number of options open to him. He's a good, strong litigator, so he could do just about anything he wants to.
Were you surprised when Johnny Cochran pointed his finger at him and said, they sent you this messenger, plainly playing the racial overtones in the case?
Well, no, I wasn't surprised. I think it was a strong thing to do. However, when you recognize that these are two combatants in a very hotly contested case, things are said that sometimes are not very well thought out, but you got to expect that those things are going to be said from time to time. These guys have been together for a very long time. They've spent a year of their life together fighting back and forth. Some of the blows are going to go below the belt.
Thanks very much, Robert Tarver and Judge Kim Worthy. We'll be back with Jerry Spence right after this. He heard a verdict in the courtroom declaring him a free man, not guilty on all counts in the murders of Nicole Brown Simpson, his ex-wife, and Ron Goldman, her friend, who happened upon her condominium June 13th, 1994, June 12th, 1994. And since then, of course, this entire country has been living with this murder trial and wondering what the outcome would be. Now we know. A jury of O.J. Simpson's peers, 10 women, 2 men, 9 of them African-American, 2 white, and 1 Latino. They have found him not guilty on all counts. NBC's George Lewis is just outside the criminal courts building, and I gather, or he's inside.
Inside
George,
still.
The press has already hit the streets out there.
Yeah, here it is from the Pasadena Star News, a suburban paper, not guilty. The picture taken right off of television, an old-fashioned extra. We thought maybe in this era of live TV we'd seen the last of these, but obviously they're going to sell a lot of newspapers with this one.
George, what's been going on around there? Are people still in a daze? Are they second-guessing the jury? And what are the possibilities that we'll ever hear from the jurors?
People are still in a daze. Everybody would like to hear from those jurors. They indicated earlier in the day they don't want to talk to the lawyers. They don't want to talk to the press. And there's a mad scramble on to see if any one of them will go back on that and maybe talk.
Thanks very much, George Lewis. At his home in Jackson Hole, Wyoming, a man who was already a household name in legal circles before this trial began and became larger than that on television across the country, and that's Jerry Spence, who's been a special consultant to NBC. Jerry, what will the fallout be, do you think, within the legal circles that you travel so easily and among trial lawyers in state legislatures about possible changes in the system? Any at all?
Well, there's going to be changes. There will never be a trial from this day forward. There will never be a trial from this day forward, Tom, in which the O.J. Simpson case doesn't in some way play some part in one way or another. I can see lawyers getting up and say, Judge, you only gave me an hour to argue this case. O.J. Simpson's lawyers got 2 days. You are forcing me to. You can hear people saying we need a jury with only a minority, with only a majority of verdict in criminal cases. You can hear all kinds of changes that are likely to come. But you know, the thing that we really need to understand is that there isn't anything basically wrong with the justice system, Tom. The fact that the country at large may believe that O.J. Simpson was guilty still doesn't prevent the country at large to understand that a man can be guilty of a crime, but the prosecution has the obligation to prove that that person is guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. And it's perfectly beholden of the system and in favor of the system that a jury will say, well, he may not be an innocent man, but the prosecution has the obligation to prove him guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. That's an important thing for us to understand in this country. The justice system may indeed be working here. There may have been a failure of proof beyond a reasonable doubt in this case. And of course, if you can send a guilty man to prison, on evidence that isn't proved beyond a reasonable doubt, we can send innocent people to prison on less than evidence that proves people guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. The other thing that I'd kind of like to suggest to you is that I think that we have all misjudged the underlying smoldering racial problem that exists in this country, and that the O.J. Simpson case was kind of a microcosmic example of that exists across the land. It exists in Philadelphia, where they're in the process, people are in the process of of reviewing over 100,000 criminal cases because of police misconduct. My own case of the Randy Weaver case, where a woman is shot holding a baby and a little boy is shot in the back while he runs home to his parents. The Waco case, the splinter groups that we're so afraid of that we see across the land are all results of our concern about the police and about racial issues. And so I think that we have to take heed to these, and I wish I were hearing from the prosecution people that are gathered there in Los Angeles a quieter kind of resolve to look into the problems of the Los Angeles Police Department and a suggestion on their part that they have a lot of work to do. I haven't heard that yet, and we need to hear it.
Thank you very much, Jerry Spence and Jackson Hole. In fact, there were no questions, curiously enough, about Mark Furman when the prosecutors did hold their news conference in the district attorney's office there. Mark Furman turned out to be a cancer on this case, especially for the prosecution's hopes that they could find conviction. Here was a man who said repeatedly to F. Lee Bailey that he had never used the N-word in the last 10 years, and then tapes proved chillingly the contrary. In fact, he'd used it repeatedly in describing to a screenwriter how he would pick on black people in South Central Los Angeles. He referred to them repeatedly by the N-word, and then when he came back into the courtroom, he invoked the Fifth Amendment privileges that he didn't want to testify against himself, and he has retreated now to northern Idaho. We'll be back right after this. By A.C. Cowlings, who was the man behind the wheel at the time of that memorable and suspenseful Bronco drive across the freeways of Southern California. It's Robert Kardashian getting out, who has been his faithful friend throughout, giving a big hug to A.C. Cowlings, who was a teammate dating back to their San Francisco days of O.J. Simpson. Loyal friend, buddy in the truest sense of the word, has stood by him throughout. So O.J. Simpson is there with his family. His future plans, if he has any, have not yet been announced. He did say in his statement that he wanted to be reunited with his family, raise the children, the two young children, in the way that he and Nicole had often discussed, and he wanted to pursue the killers of his wife and Ron Goldman. Beyond that, we don't know where he'll go or when he'll share with us what his thinking may be on where he should go at this point. NBC's essayist throughout all of this, from a Southern California point of view, has been Ann Taylor Fleming, who joins us once.
Conclusion. And I've got to tell you, you bring up a very good point, Roger, because several people who have sent us messages overnight on CompuServe, etc. Chris is talking to some of them. He's monitoring the forum today. A lot of them are saying they did not prove it beyond a reasonable doubt to me, even though I, in my heart of hearts, think he did, in fact, do it. So they're making...
By that house, you know, practically every day over the entire year. I just walk my dog around that neighborhood. And I must say, I, like so many people, did not think that I would walk by that house and that he would be back in it. And the irony also isn't lost on me that he goes back to, in this massively segregated, racially divided city, he goes back to a white neighborhood where most of the people think he's guilty. And yet, to the African-American community, he's a hero. So, I mean, all of these ironies, all of these fault lines, all of the things we've talked about, I think that most of the people I'm talking to feel very somber, sad, confused. We look at the pictures that you all were showing, for example, of the Howard University, all the African-American students cheering and jumping up and down. And you say to yourself, you know, they have been living in a different reality. And, you know, I must say I agree with Jerry. The one thing this prosecution in the city has to address is that different reality. I mean, we have to say, okay, if they can look at this trial so differently and come to a conclusion that is opposite what so many others feel, there must be some reasoning here, and we've got to look at this police department, and we've got to look at racism. You know, I was struck by the reading of Bill Clinton when they said he was somber. I think that's the appropriate emotion. You know, it's a somber moment, and it's a moment of severe reckoning with any luck.
And what about the sense of the community in terms of being willing, not just willing, but eager to do something about some of the issues that you have just raised, trying to heal the racial wounds, obviously, trying to do something about the police department? Los Angeles is an urban sprawl, and it seems to me, in my recent visits at least, that it's been divided up much more by fiefdom than it ever has been before. Many more walled communities, more people retreating to their own distinctive neighborhoods and not looking for any connective tissue.
I think that's so right, Tom. You know this city. I mean, we fly by each other's neighborhoods on these freeways, and it is a pronouncedly segregated community. One of the things that I hate where I live is, you're right, everybody now has walled guards, signed security guards. There is no flow in this city. There's much less flow probably in this city than much more denser cities like Manhattan, where you bump into all different colors of people on the street. Eagerness may be too strong a word. I certainly think in the guts and souls and hearts of those of us who care, and there are a number of us here, African American and white, we recognize that it cannot go on this way. I mean, how much more does it take? I mean, we've burned the city down. We now have a verdict which is dramatically polarizing. I mean, one of the things, though, that the city adamantly needs is some sort of moral leadership. I mean, I'm looking for people, and I agree with Jerry. I hope Garcetti comes out. I hope we hear from Reardon. I hope we hear from the police chief. I mean, somebody has to stand up now and say, look, this is a severe problem, not only for this city, but for this country, and we have got to look at it. I mean, I don't know how many more wake-up calls this city needs.
Right,
hopefully, yeah, sorry.
I've always wanted to cut you off, but always politely. We'll be back after this.
You did it.
A hug to Robert Kardashian, a longtime friend of O.J. Simpson, and recently got his bar card back and helped represent O.J. Simpson through the trial. Okay, we're going to move the camera to the backyard, see if we can see what you were looking at. All the family members, the relevant family members, are inside the house, so we're going to move to the backyard area, and we're going to see if we can see the screened-off area that David's been telling us about.
Also, Bob, you know, while you're up there, you ought to tilt a little bit picture to the left to show where the press is, because, you know, you're getting fabulous pictures, and we're getting really good pictures from the ground because we're on top of a ladder here. But most of the press are crowded in here, as you can see, like a bunch of people on a college prank. You know, how many people can get into the phone booth?
Oh, that's right. You know what? I know something. They have actually shut down most of this area, and the press has been herded into just one small area. Now, this is a number of, these are a lot of people from the press. There's about 150 of them. Now, the KU uplink satellite trucks are still being blocked and barricaded from the area, and they are not being allowed through the area. And I don't know why. Under State Penal Code Section 409.5, they're supposed to be allowed and have access to the scene, but you know, nothing in this case has been following all the numbers anyway. But there's the media area. Now,
hey,
to
Bob?
the left.
Bob,
yes.
do you see my hand from up there?
No, I don't.
Look to the front of the line, and you'll see where I am in relation to you, and where I am in relation to the courtyard.
Okay,
You see that?
Arnell is back. Yes, I did. You were in the front.
Okay.
We're going to go back to Arnell. See, let's get to the front of the house. Arnell is back in the front yard. Let's move to the front. No, you don't have to. You can move rapidly. Let me just, this is like a flying camera platform, and it takes about 8 hands to make everything work. And we're going to move around to the front of the house and let's get a shot of Arnell that was out in the front of the home. Doesn't look like she's there now. Okay, the front, wait a minute. So I was looking through a skylight, and I could see somebody through the skylight window. But this is the front of O.J. Simpson's house. I'll give you an aerial tour, if you would, if you'd like, of the O.J. Simpson estate. Now, this is sitting in Ashford in Rockingham, and this play area was designed and created for O.J. Simpson's children. And they played here. And after the murders occurred for a number of months, we saw Cato the dog down in the Sandy area. And the dog seemed to stand guard, and we saw a number of security guards. This is the front of the house. This is the U-shaped driveway. The one driveway takes you from Ashford, the other to Rockingham. And then as we go to a wider shot, the infamous backyard crawl space.
From CBS News, you are watching live coverage of the aftermath of O.J. Simpson's not guilty on all counts verdict on CBS News.
You heard the prosecution and defense talk about. Now over to this area. is a tennis court. We've never seen anybody use it, never. And over to the left is a pool. And this pool area is just O.J. Simpson's room. Let me zoom on in. Overlooks the pool area. And there you can see O.J. Simpson's balcony right here. And
Well, we turn to Peter Neufeld, member of the defense team, who's been generous enough to come in and chat with us this afternoon. Very quickly, because we need to take a break here. But at any time, do you recall O.J. Simpson saying anything along the lines, listen, you guys are doing a good job, but I think you need to be more aggressive. You're letting these prosecutors get away with an awful lot in there.
Well, there's no question that Mr. Simpson played a very active role in his own defense here. And I think most of you who were covering the trial while it was happening could actually hear O.J. calling out questions to us while we were cross-examining witnesses, telling us that we had left out this question or we didn't follow through enough on that question. And there was no question that there was one extra lawyer sitting at the defense table, and that was O.J. throughout. He always was very forthright with his own opinions, not just in the holding cell, not just on Saturday night when we'd visit with him, but right there in court, in session, while the jury was sitting there. And that's just the way he is.
Did you ever hear him make any reference to his football days and listen, if I can do that, I can do this, that sort of thing?
Not necessarily that directly, but at times he did talk about some of the things he was able to do on the field, and no matter how inclement the weather was, no matter who the adversaries were, he was able to get through, and he was hopeful and confident that the same would apply here.
And indeed it did. Champagne all around. How sweet it is for the Simpson family. Glasses of champagne, toasting one another, toasting the defense team.
That's his sister and niece who you just saw.
Right. Any indication of to whom O.J. Simpson was the closest?
Now across the world to Cape Town, South Africa, someone who has been with us throughout this trial.
Very tight nuclear family there, and he's very close with his mother. He's extremely close with his sisters, and of course he's very close with both his elder son and his elder daughter, and he hopes beyond all hope that he can now get back in touch with his younger two children as well. But the whole Simpson family was there all the time, and one thing that became very clear to me that both of his sisters play a very active role in defining his conduct, both in and outside the courtroom.
Peter Neufeld of the defense team, who's helping us with our CBS News reaction and commentary in the wake of the not guilty verdict for O.J. Simpson. We'll have more after these messages, so stay here with us.
Many whites who had saw pieces of the trial assumed that he was guilty and would be convicted, and many blacks had doubts about that. And I think that's a sense of believing that police corruption can occur, that people could be charged with crimes that they didn't commit, and that a jury system might lead to a greater chance of innocence, or at least verdicts of not guilty. So I think there was a level of relief that the verdict was not guilty in some quarters, and great disappointment in other quarters.
Mr. Ogletree, it's very hard for us to know, because we've not been able to talk to the jury, to what degree, if any, race played a role in the final verdict. But obviously race was a major factor in the case itself. Do you think that this country needs to use the O.J. Simpson trial as a kind of restarting point, if you will, to start healing some of the racial wounds in this country?
I think it's going to be a restarting point in the black community. I wish it were that way across the country. Tom, you know, you and I talked about this trial last July 1994, and I told you then that I thought that there was very little chance that O.J. Simpson would be convicted. Not because of race, but remember, no confession, no eyewitness, no weapon, no bloody clothes found. And I think all those factors, along with the other issues raised by the defense, was enough for any jury, black, white, young or old, to say that they had a reasonable doubt as to his guilt. The problem is that I think we've injected race into this case in large doses, and I think for unsubstantiated reasons. I think these were 12 very honest, hardworking, determined people who put race aside largely when it was irrelevant, but considered it where it was irrelevant. Mark Furman, I think, more than anyone else, lost this case. I don't know of any case, Tom, where a police officer has lied, and that lie has been shown in spades in the same trial like it was shown in this case. They had many good reasons. The timeline, the socks, the glove didn't fit. They had many good reasons. But Mark Furman, it all comes back to Mark Furman, that he, in some respects, as he said in his own statement, this is his case, and he lost it for the government. I think we also should be careful about criticizing the prosecutors. Marcia Clark, Chris Darden, they did a very good job with what they had to work with. If Mark Furman's tapes had not arisen in this case, I think it would have been very difficult to get an acquittal. So I'm not going to be criticizing the prosecutors. They did what they could, given the problem they had with Mark Furman being a central part of their case.
What lessons will you take back to your law students at Harvard University that grow out of this case that you might not have had in your own course planning in the past?
Well, quite a few, Tom, and part of it is what I'm going to talk about here in South Africa. I think this case is going to affect American jurisprudence for a long time. First of all, I think it's going to put cameras on trial, and whether or not cameras should be allowed in our courtroom, because I think they do in some ways distort the process of reality, and it certainly changed the way the judge and the lawyers and the jury behaved in this case. The jury, in some sense, knowing that there was a public persona coming to court in black one day or refusing to come to court, those things are because of the enormous press. The second, I think it undermines the glaring inequity in our justice system, that here a rich man is able to influence justice by having Barry Scheck and Peter Neufeld, who are very good friends of mine, and Johnny Cochran, who's a very good friend, the best that money can buy, represent him. He has a different sense of justice. The good things about the trial is that people saw a preliminary hearing. They know how a case is put together. They know how experts are cross-examined. Classic cross-examination, classic direct. The bad things that shed more light on the problems of the LA Police Department. My office has written a book called Beyond the Rodney King Story, anticipating this very likely result, that people would be so frustrated with police conduct after Rodney King that results like this are predictable, because people can no longer trust the police, all the police, to do what's right. And I think that's one of the sad lessons, that too many police officers are going to be labeled unfairly because of this trial, and there'll be views that there are more Mark Furmans out there.
Mr. Ogletree, thank you very much. It's very late where you are, I know, from my past visits to South Africa. We'll tell you as well that there has been a reaction from the U.S. Justice Department now. The U.S. Department of Justice will take all appropriate steps to investigate allegations of policeman misconduct that were raised at the Simpson trial. As we have previously stated, the Justice Department has opened an inquiry into the issues raised by the Mark Furman tapes. Now that the Simpson trial is over, we can proceed to evaluate all available evidence and conduct future investigations as warranted. We take such allegations seriously. In those tapes, Mr. Furman not only used the N-word, but he talked freely about picking on African-American citizens in Southern California, which would be a gross violation of their civil rights. That, presumably, is what the Justice Department is talking about, among many other matters. We'll be back with more right after this. O.J. Simpson is a free man, acquitted on all counts of murder and the deaths of his ex-wife, Nicole Brown Simpson, and Ron Goldman. He's now with family and friends at his estate in Brentwood, California. In the criminal courts building in downtown Los Angeles is Gloria Allred. Gloria Allred is a well-known, not just Southern California lawyer, a national lawyer who has worked often for women's legal issues, and she has been representing the Brown family in this case. There is the immediate question about the custody and the guardianship of the children of O.J. Simpson and the late Nicole Brown Simpson. How do you think that's going to be resolved, Ms. Allred?
Well, the Brown family has always put the best interests of the children first, and I know that they will always do so. They have provided a very loving and a caring, a supportive environment and family for them over the last year. Their grandparents, Sidney and Justin's grandparents, Lou and Juditha, have done everything for these children, as have Denise and Dominique and Tanya, their aunts and their little cousins. They've been in such a wonderful, loving family during the past year, in this most critical year of the children's lives. The family is just taking this moment by moment. They're not going to have a comment right now on the future of the children, but I hope that every adult in these children's lives will always put the children first, as the Brown family has.
But isn't it going to be hard to keep these children from O.J. Simpson, who is, after all, their surviving parent and a man who wants to be reunited with them?
Well, we'll have to see what Mr. Simpson does, but right now, I think that it's a difficult day for the Brown family, and they will not be having any comment on the children.
Before the verdict was read in the holding room just outside Department 103, Maria Shriver told us that the Brown family and O.J. Simpson's sisters and children, for that matter, were in touch with each other. There has been a close relationship. Does that suggest that there is no deep bitterness between these two families?
Well, all I can say is that every time I have seen the Brown family in connection with the Simpson family in this courthouse, they've always reached out to the Simpson family, and they've been very sensitive. Juditha Brown, the grandmother, Sydney and Justin, has reached out to the other grandmother, to Eunice Simpson, Mr. Simpson's mother, who's in a wheelchair. She's bent down. She's talked to her. They've shared grandmother stories with each other. They both have those children in common, and I think that there is a real feeling that the Brown family does not blame any other member of the Simpson family for what has occurred in this situation, and I hope that they can have a relationship in the future. I think it's important.
Was the Brown family stunned by the verdict?
I think that everybody was stunned by the verdict. I think everybody was shocked, and we spent some time together. They left the courthouse. The family wants to thank everyone in the nation who has prayed for justice in this case. And I know there are millions of people who have supported that prayer for justice that the family has been praying for over this past year. They want to sincerely thank everyone out there who has prayed for justice, and they appreciate their prayers. And also, I hope that everyone will try to respect the Browns' need and right to have privacy on this most pivotal day in their lives.
Gloria Allred, thank you very much.
I thank you very much, and yes, thank you.
Well-known Southern California lawyer who represents the Brown family. Thank you, Ms. Allred. We'll be back after this.
Yeah, I'm glad to be back. I feel free.
What do you feel about the verdict?
I think we did the right thing. You know, matter of fact, I know we did.
Why such a short deliberation? What went on in there?
Well, right now, I'd rather have no comment. I'll talk at a later time. Right now, I'm tired.
How did you make the decision so fast?
Well, we've been there 9 months. You know, don't take another 9 months. You know, yeah.
What was it that made you convinced that he was innocent?
I'll talk to you later, okay? Brenda,
Brenda, do you believe there was a police conspiracy?
Yeah, okay. All right. Yeah.
She said that I'll talk to you later. The jury has said collectively that it would rather not talk to the press or to the attorneys in this case, but inevitably there is a breakdown of that common commitment, and we will begin to hear about why those 10 women and 2 men made the decision that they did. Jack and Ira are with us once again, Jack Ford and Ira Reiner. She said, I think we did the right thing. In fact, I know we did the right thing. Did you read any ambivalence into her decision in that, Ira?
No ambivalence there, none at all. You know, it's interesting, you were talking earlier about live cameras. You know, the public, because of the live cameras, will be able to make their own judgment as to whether this case was simply a failure of evidence or whether it was a jury nullification, and if this really did involve issues of racial antagonism. So in this particular case, I think all things considered and what is at stake, it was very good that there was a live camera.
Jack Ford, what about cameras across the country?
Give it back. Well, Tom, we've heard some other people say that I think this will one of the results of this case will be that people will sit down and take another look at the ideas of cameras in the courtroom. You know, you and I have talked about this before. I tried cases before I got into television journalism with cameras in the courtroom, and I happen to believe that they were very helpful. But like with anything in the justice system, there needs to be some governing mechanism, something to make sure it's done appropriately. But my concern is, and certainly I'm not terribly objective about this, but my concern is that there's going to be some sort of reactionary backlash here where people are going to blame the cameras for every perceived problem with this trial. Hopefully judges are going to sit down and take a look at that and realize that that's a convenient and I don't happen to think correct answer to whatever problems took place in this trial. But you can bet that among other issues that have been catapulted out of this trial, and there are a whole lot of them, one that's going to be reopened to debate is going to be the idea of cameras in the courtroom.
Jack and Ira, stay right there, because when we come back, I want to talk to you about juries, how long they have to be sequestered, and what we can expect from them once the court is over, once the trial is over. We'll be back right after this.
Good morning. Rise and...
We, the jury, in the above entitled action, find the defendant, Orenthal James Simpson, not guilty of the crime of murder in violation of...
Simpson, home tonight, a free man.
From NBC News, this is NBC Nightly News with Tom Brokaw.
Good evening. By now, the news is well known, but many questions remain. How did the jury decide that O.J. Simpson was not guilty on all counts? And as he celebrates at his home tonight, what is the future for this most famous murder defendant ever now that he's free? What of his children? Can the Goldman family find the justice they're seeking in a civil suit against Simpson? The verdict is in, but the story is not over. Tonight, NBC's David Bloom on this remarkable day, and Maria Shriver, who is just outside the O.J. Simpson estate in Brentwood, where a party is underway. We'll be talking to Maria shortly, but we begin with David Bloom, who has covered the trial from the beginning.
Tom, O.J. Simpson walked into Judge Lancito's courtroom this morning, uncertain as to whether he would spend much of the rest of his life in prison or go free.
Our four-person juror number one.
O.J. Simpson stared toward the jury. Defense attorney Johnny Cochran clasped his hands as if in prayer. And Robert Kardashian, Simpson's longtime friend and lawyer, looked toward the heavens. Then Simpson stood to face the mostly black jury as the verdicts were read.
We, the jury, in the above entitled action, find the defendant, Orenthal James Simpson, not guilty of the crime of murder in violation of Penal Code Section 187A, a felony upon Nicole Brown Simpson, a human being, as charged in count 1 of the information. Superior Court of the...
From the family of murder victim Ronald Goldman, sobs of disbelief.
Count 2, is this your verdict? Jury number 12.
Sister Kim Goldman, weeping uncontrollably, embraced by her father Fred, even as O.J. Simpson's family, a few feet away, rejoiced. Simpson's daughter Arnell smiling, his son Jason slumped in tears. The defense team gathered as if in a victory huddle. Fred Goldman stunned, shaken. Prosecutors stone-faced as Simpson mouthed a thank you to the jury and clenched his fist in triumph, a free man after 474 days behind bars.
All right, the defendant having been acquitted of both charges, he is ordered transported to an appropriate sheriff's facility and released forthwith.
20 minutes later, Simpson was back at the jail to retrieve his belongings, and then, in a scene eerily reminiscent of last year's low-speed Bronco chase, Simpson, this time in a white minivan, but again pursued by news helicopters, arrived home at his Rockingham Estates, where he was embraced by A.C. Collins, Simpson's best friend, who'd been behind the wheel of the Bronco 16 months before.
First, I want to thank God.
At a courthouse press conference called by the defense and Simpson's elated family, his mother spoke.
Well, I was always in prayer. I knew that my son was innocent.
His sister spoke.
And I tell you, I just feel like standing on top of this table and dancing a jig. And I just want to thank you guys.
And eldest son Jason read a statement from his father.
I'm relieved that this part of the incredible nightmare that occurred on June 12, 1994 is over. My first obligation is to my young children, who will be raised the way that Nicole and I had always planned. But when things have settled a bit, I will pursue, as my primary goal in life, the killer or killers who slaughtered Nicole and Mr. Goldman. They are out there somewhere. Whatever it takes to identify them and bring them in, I'll provide somehow.
Defense attorney Johnny Cochran, who'd compared former Detective Mark Furman to Adolf Hitler and who'd asked jurors to strike a blow against racism and police corruption, defended his tactics.
This stuff about playing a race card is preposterous. It would malpractice if a man has racist views in a case and a lawyer doesn't pursue that.
But prosecutors were aghast. Los Angeles District Attorney Gil Garcetti, his confidence gone, his voice wavering.
This was an emotional trial, and apparently their decision was based on emotion that overcame the reason.
A subdued Marcia Clark.
Please don't let this make you lose faith in our system.
And accepting Christopher Darden.
But I'm not bitter, and I'm not angry.
It was too much for the emotionally racked Darden to take. He left the room shortly before Fred Goldman spoke.
This prosecution team didn't lose today. I deeply believe that this country lost today. Justice was not served.
Simpson still faces a possible custody battle for his young children and wrongful death suits filed by the victims' families. But tonight, they were celebrating at his Rockingham estates, truth and justice being in the eyes of the beholder. David Bloom, NBC News, Los Angeles.
Thank you, David. Now let's go back to Maria Shriver, who is just outside the Rockingham estate, where she's been able to have some conversations, at least, with members of the Simpson party. What's going on inside, Maria, as far as we can understand it?
Well, there is a party going on here, as David Bloom said, Tom. There are helicopters overhead trying to get any glimpse of O.J. Simpson that they possibly can. Balloons have been arriving here, big multicolored bunches, flowers, wheelbarrows full of flowers, friends, relatives. O.J. Simpson's sisters came out a little earlier in the day, thumbs up to the media, thanked everybody, said they wanted to talk, they couldn't. You see a lot of jubilation going here, a very different situation than you saw at the DA's office. And Larry Schiller told me that O.J. Simpson would talk to the media in a couple of days. Right now, he wanted to get some rest, see his friends, see his family. Tom?
All right, thanks very much, Maria Shriver. There's also one report that he will be going on to Cabo San Lucas, which is on the tip of the Yucatan Peninsula of Mexico. It's an old haunt for Robert Kardashian, his good friend. As for the jury, the 10 women and 2 men told the judge they didn't want to discuss this case with the lawyers or the news media, and they headed for their homes immediately after the verdict was read. And as NBC's Kelly O'Donnell tells us tonight, so far, for the most part, they are keeping their word. So far.
They have uniformly.
The Simpson jury is not ready to give up one of Judge Ito's admonitions, the rule not to discuss the case.
You have also indicated to the court unanimously a desire not to speak to the attorneys after the conclusion of the trial, and not to speak with the news media either.
Crews of photographers wait outside their homes, but most of the 12 jurors' whereabouts remain a mystery. Juror number 7, Brenda Morgan, uneasy about talking.
I think we did the right thing. You know, matter of fact, I know we did.
Prosecutors don't understand it or why the jury refused to explain it to them.
We want to hear from the jurors before we make any other comments concerning their decision today.
The daughter of 4-person Armanda Cooley is relieved.
It's been a very long haul, and like I said, we're just very happy that this has finally come to a conclusion.
Whatever their verdict, the homecoming is well earned. Consider this. O.J. Simpson served only 108 days longer than his jury. He spent 474 days in jail. The jury lived under lock and key 266 days. Their privileges were different, too. Simpson was allowed lots of visitors and private phone calls. But jurors sequestered at this luxury downtown hotel had their calls and outside contact closely monitored by guards. In exchange for their service, each juror was paid $5 a day. They've been gone so long, that added up to about $1,300 each. Simpson is back home, his house surrounded by press. Tonight, the jury of his peers finds the cameras waiting for them, too. Kelly O'Donnell, NBC News, Los Angeles.
So what can O.J. Simpson possibly do next? We'll deal with that question later here on NBC Nightly News. We'll have more on this exceptional day when NBC Nightly News continues. Up next, what our experts make of this now that it's all over.
What's amazing about technology?
I think you could run this.